In the darkest corners of Japan, travelers whisper about Akateko, the severed hand of a child that appears to those who journey alone. This ghostly appendage, torn from its young owner by violence lost to history, drifts through the night seeking what was stolen from it. Tonight, 10 unsuspecting travelers will encounter this supernatural terror. From blizzard-covered mountain roads to abandoned subway tunnels, from ancient temples to forgotten hospitals, each will discover that some encounters leave permanent marks, and some hands refuse to let go. These are their stories. These are the nights they wished they had never traveled alone. Before we start the story, here's a fact. Almost everyone enjoys these videos but forgets to like. Ignore it tonight and maybe your bathroom mirror will start smiling back at you. Alright, let's get back to the story. The climbing route to Yarigiateke's northern face was considered one of Japan's most challenging alpine ascents, requiring technical expertise, perfect weather conditions, and at least 3 days of sustained effort to reach the summit and return safely. But for Tetsuya Kimura, a professional mountain guide with over 20 years of experience in the Japan Alps, the real challenge of this particular expedition had nothing to do with rock faces, weather patterns, or equipment failures. The challenge came from his climbing partner, a wealthy Tokyo businessman named Sato who had insisted on hiring Tetsuya for a private ascent despite having minimal mountaineering experience and an obvious disregard for the safety protocols that kept climbers alive in the unforgiving environment of the high peaks. The problems had started before they even reached base camp. Sato had arrived with expensive gear that he clearly didn't know how to use properly, a dismissive attitude toward Tetsuya's safety briefings, and a collection of supplements and energy drinks that suggested he thought alpine climbing was simply a matter of physical conditioning rather than technical skill and mental preparation. Most concerning of all, Sato had insisted on bringing along what he claimed were good luck charms, a collection of small wooden boxes that he refused to let Tetsuya examine and that he insisted on carrying in his pack despite the added weight and bulk they would create during the technical portions of the climb. The first day of the ascent proceeded normally enough, with Tetsuya leading them through the lower elevation approaches and teaching Sato the basic rope work and belaying techniques that would be essential for the more challenging sections ahead. The weather was perfect, clear skies, minimal wind, and the kind of crisp mountain air that made even experienced climbers feel optimistic about their chances of reaching the summit. But as they established their first night's camp on a narrow ledge about halfway up the mountain, Tetsuya began to notice things that made him question his client's mental stability and his own decision to accept this particular guiding assignment. The wooden boxes that Sato had insisted on bringing turned out to contain what appeared to be children's toys, small wooden blocks, miniature dolls, and other items that seemed completely inappropriate for a serious mountaineering expedition. But what made the toys truly disturbing was their condition. Despite their obvious age, they appeared to have been recently handled, showing signs of wear and use that suggested they had been played with regularly. Some of the wooden blocks had small handprints pressed into their surfaces, as if they had been gripped by tiny, sweaty palms, and the dolls showed the kind of loving where that came from being constantly carried and cuddled by young children. When Tetsuya asked about the significance of the toys, Sato's explanation was both vague and unsettling. They belonged to children who couldn't finish their journeys, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I bring them along to help them see the world they never got to explore. Think of it as a memorial service, but with more adventure. He arranged the toys carefully around their campsite, positioning them as if they were seated around a campfire, ready to participate in the evening's activities. That night, as they settled into their sleeping bags on the narrow ledge, Tetsuya was kept awake by sounds that shouldn't have been possible at their elevation and isolation. At first, he thought he was hearing the normal noises of the mountain environment, wind moving through rock formations, the distant calls of night birds, the subtle sounds of thermal expansion and contraction in the metal components of their climbing gear. But gradually, he began to pick out more specific sounds that seemed to be coming from very close to their campsite. The sounds were unmistakably those of children at play, soft giggling, the gentle clacking of wooden toys being moved around, and what sounded like whispered conversations in the high, sweet voices of young children engaged in imaginative games. The sounds seemed to be coming from the area where Sato had arranged his collection of toys, as if invisible children had joined their campsite and were playing with the wooden blocks and dolls under the cover of darkness. Tetsuya tried to convince himself that he was experiencing altitude-induced hallucinations or perhaps some form of auditory pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon that causes people to perceive meaningful patterns in random sounds. But the children's voices were too clear, too consistent, and too interactive to be dismissed as mere imagination. He could hear them responding to each other, engaging in the kind of cooperative play that required multiple participants, and occasionally making comments that seemed to reference their current location high on the mountainside. When morning came, Tetsuya discovered that the toys had been rearranged during the night. Instead of the neat circle that Sato had created around their campfire, the toys were now scattered across the ledge in patterns that looked like the aftermath of an active play session. Some of the wooden blocks had been stacked into small towers. The dolls had been positioned as if they were climbing imaginary rock faces, and several items had been moved to the very edge of the ledge, as if the invisible children had been looking out over the valley below. Most disturbing of all, there were new handprints visible on several of the toys, small, childlike prints that appeared to have been made with some sort of reddish substance that could have been mud, paint, or something more organic and troubling. The handprints were fresh, showing fine details like fingerprint ridges and palm lines, and they were positioned in ways that suggested the invisible children had been actively playing with the toys throughout the night. Sato seemed pleased rather than disturbed by these developments. "They're enjoying the adventure," he said as he carefully cleaned the handprints from the toys and repacked them in their wooden boxes. "This is exactly what I hoped would happen. They've been trapped for so long, unable to explore or play. This gives them a chance to experience things they never could when they were limited by their physical circumstances." As they continued their ascent on the second day, the technical challenges of the climb began to intensify. The route required complex rope work, precise footwork on exposed rock faces, and constant attention to weather conditions that could change rapidly at their elevation. But Tetsuya found it increasingly difficult to focus on these normal mountaineering concerns because of the growing evidence that they were not alone on the mountain. Throughout the day, he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, small figures that seemed to be climbing alongside them, keeping pace with their progress but always just out of direct sight. When he would turn to look directly at the movement, he would see nothing but empty rock and sky. But the sense of being accompanied by invisible companions was so strong that he found himself instinctively adjusting his climbing techniques to account for the additional presence, leaving extra space on ledges and being more careful with rope management as if he were actually guiding a larger party than just himself and Sato. The invisible companions seemed to be most active during the more challenging sections of the climb. When they encountered a particularly difficult pitch that required delicate balance and precise hand placement, Tetsuya would hear what sounded like children's voices offering encouragement and advice. "Be careful, Oni-san. Don't look down. You can do it." The voices were so clear and supportive that he found himself responding to them automatically, saying, "Thank you," and "I'll be careful," before remembering that he was supposed to be alone with his client. Sato seemed to be having similar experiences, but his reactions were very different from Tetsuya's growing unease. The businessman appeared to be thriving on the invisible children's presence, engaging them in one-sided conversations about the climbing route, the view from various elevations, and the technical aspects of mountaineering that he was learning from Tetsuya. "Look how high we've climbed," he would say to empty air. "Can you see all the way to Tokyo from here? Tomorrow we'll go even higher." That evening, As they established their second camp on an even more precarious ledge near the final approach to the summit, Tetsuya made a discovery that revealed the true horror of their situation. While Sato was busy arranging his toys for another night of invisible play, Tetsuya examined the wooden boxes more carefully and found that they contained more than just children's playthings. Hidden beneath false bottoms in each box were small collections of what appeared to be dried organic material, tiny fingers, small pieces of scalp with hair still attached, and other fragments that could only have come from the bodies of young children. The realization hit him like an avalanche. Sato was not simply an eccentric businessman bringing memorial toys on a climbing expedition. He was a collector who had somehow acquired pieces of dead children, and he was using the isolation and extreme environment of the mountain climb to commune with their spirits in ways that would have been impossible in normal social settings. The toys were not mementos but lures, designed to attract the ghosts of children who had died violently and were still seeking the comfort and play that had been denied to them in life. As this understanding dawned on him, Tetsuya became aware that the invisible children's voices had changed in tone and content. Instead of the encouraging, playful chatter he had been hearing throughout the day, the voices now carried undertones of fear and desperation. "Don't let him keep us. We want to go home. Help us get away from the bad man." The children were not willing participants in Sato's twisted memorial service. They were prisoners, bound to their physical remains and forced to accompany him on adventures they had no desire to experience. The ghostly children began to materialize more clearly as darkness fell over their precarious campsite. Tetsuya could see translucent figures moving around the ledge, young children who appeared to be missing various body parts, their small forms incomplete and obviously traumatized by whatever had happened to them before death. Some were missing hands, others had portions of their heads or faces absent, and all of them moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of spirits that had been violently separated from physical existence. The children gathered around Sato with obvious reluctance, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of visibility like flames in a strong wind. He spoke to them with the false enthusiasm of an adult who had never learned how to genuinely connect with young people, treating them like possessions rather than individuals with their own desires and fears. "Isn't this exciting?" he asked the frightened spirits. "Tomorrow we'll reach the summit, and you'll be able to see all of Japan spread out below us. Not many children get to have adventures like this." But the ghostly children were not interested in adventures or summit views. They were trapped in a form of supernatural slavery, bound to follow Sato wherever he chose to take their remains, unable to find peace or move on to whatever realm awaited them after death. Their voices rose in a chorus of pleading and desperation as they begged Tetsuya to help them escape from their captor. "Please, Oni-san, don't let him take us any higher. We're scared of the cold and the wind. We just want to go home and rest." The children's pleas became more urgent as the temperature dropped and the wind began to pick up, signaling the approach of a weather system that could make their exposed position on the mountain face extremely dangerous. Tetsuya realized that he had to make a choice between his own safety and his moral obligation to help the trapped spirits. If he confronted Sato directly, he risked a violent confrontation on a narrow ledge thousands of feet above the valley floor, where any physical struggle could result in both of their deaths. But if he allowed the expedition to continue, he would be complicit in the continued imprisonment of children who had already suffered more than any young person should have to endure. As he weighed his options, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. The clear skies that had blessed their ascent gave way to heavy clouds and increasing wind, and the temperature dropped to levels that would make continued climbing extremely hazardous. Under normal circumstances, Tetsuya would have insisted on beginning an immediate descent to safer elevations, but the presence of the ghostly children complicated every decision. The spectral forms of the trapped children became more agitated as the storm approached, their translucent bodies flickering more rapidly and their voices rising to levels that competed with the increasing wind. They seemed to understand that their situation was about to become even more desperate, trapped not just by Sato's collection but also by the dangerous weather conditions that could force them to remain on the exposed mountain face until the storm passed. It was then that Tetsuya noticed something that gave him an idea for freeing the children without directly confronting their captor. The wooden boxes that contained the children's remains were positioned near the edge of the ledge, and the increasing wind was already causing them to shift and slide. If he could somehow cause the boxes to fall from the ledge during the confusion of the storm, the physical anchors that bound the children's spirits to Sato would be destroyed, potentially freeing them to find peace. As the wind reached dangerous levels and visibility dropped to nearly zero in the swirling snow and cloud, Tetsuya made his move. Using the storm as cover, he carefully repositioned several of the boxes closer to the edge of the ledge, making it appear as if they had been moved by the wind rather than by deliberate action. Then he waited for the right moment, a particularly strong gust that would provide the final push needed to send the boxes tumbling into the abyss below. When the moment came, Tetsuya gave the boxes the slightest additional push, and they disappeared into the swirling storm, carrying with them the physical remains that had kept the children's spirits bound to their tormentor. The effect was immediate and profound. The ghostly children's voices rose in a chorus of relief and gratitude as their forms began to glow with peaceful, warm light rather than the cold desperation they had shown before. "Thank you, Oni-san. We can go home now. We're free." The children's spirits began to fade away, not disappearing but transforming into something more complete and peaceful. As each spirit departed, Tetsuya heard them say goodbye with the innocent joy of children who had finally been released from a nightmare that had lasted far too long. Sato's reaction to the loss of his collection was immediate and violent. Despite the dangerous weather conditions, he began screaming accusations at Tetsuya and attempting to search for the fallen boxes in the storm. His behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous, forcing Tetsuya to physically restrain him to prevent him from falling from the ledge in his desperation to recover his twisted trophies. The storm that had provided cover for freeing the children also made descent impossible for the next 18 hours. Tetsuya spent that time keeping both himself and his increasingly unstable client alive on the exposed ledge, using all of his mountaineering skills to maintain their shelter and prevent hypothermia. But without the supernatural assistance of the ghostly children who had been subtly helping their progress, the technical challenges of the descent would be significantly more difficult. When the weather finally cleared enough to allow safe descent, Tetsuya found that Sato had suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. The businessman was catatonic, responding to neither verbal commands nor physical prompts, forcing Tetsuya to essentially carry him down the mountain in a rescue operation that took nearly 2 full days to complete. Sato was hospitalized upon their return to civilization, diagnosed with severe altitude sickness and psychological trauma that left him unable to provide coherent accounts of what had happened during the expedition. Tetsuya never spoke publicly about the true events on the mountain, but he made sure that authorities were anonymously informed about Sato's background and potential connections to missing children cases, leading to investigations that eventually revealed the full extent of his crimes. In the years that followed, Tetsuya continued to guide climbers in the Japan Alps, but he always carried small offerings of toys and sweets that he would leave at summit shrines, hoping to provide comfort to any other children's spirits that might be trapped in the mountain's remote places. And sometimes, on perfect climbing days when the weather was ideal and the route seemed to present fewer challenges than expected, he would hear the distant sound of children's laughter carried on the mountain wind, and he would know that somewhere in the high peaks, young spirits who had been freed from earthly torment were finally able to play in the eternal sunshine above the clouds. The job of rural mail delivery in Shizuoka Prefecture's most remote districts required a special kind of person, someone who didn't mind long hours alone on winding mountain roads. who could navigate unmarked paths to isolated farmhouses, and who possessed the patience to deal with elderly customers who might not see another human being for weeks at a time. Keisuke Tanaka had been working the route for 8 years, long enough to know every twist in the mountain roads, every barking dog that would announce his arrival, and every customer who would invite him in for tea and conversation that stretched far beyond the simple delivery of mail and packages. But the route had been changing over the past few months in ways that had nothing to do with new construction, seasonal road conditions, or changes in the postal service's delivery requirements. Houses that had been occupied for decades were being abandoned as their elderly residents passed away or moved to care facilities in larger towns. Farms that had been productive for generations were being left to return to wilderness as younger family members chose urban careers over agricultural traditions. Entire sections of his route were becoming ghost communities where Keisuke might drive for kilometers without seeing any signs of current human habitation. The most disturbing changes were occurring along the stretch of road that wound through the Aokigahara region, where dense forests had always created an atmosphere of isolation and mystery even during the busiest farming seasons. 3 houses along this section had been abandoned in the past 6 months, leaving their mailboxes standing like monuments to families who had simply disappeared from the area without forwarding addresses or explanations. Keisuke had been instructed to continue delivering mail to these addresses until official change of address notifications were received, which meant that he spent several hours each week driving to increasingly desolate locations to deliver letters and packages that would never be collected. The first sign that something was seriously wrong with his route came on a foggy Tuesday morning in late October. Keisuke had arrived at one of the abandoned houses to find the mailbox stuffed with letters and packages that he was certain he had delivered the previous week. The mail was arranged neatly, as if someone had organized it carefully, but it was all addressed to the family that had moved away months earlier. More puzzling, some of the letters appeared to be much older than a week. The postmarks showed dates from several months ago, but the envelopes looked fresh and clean, as if they had just been processed by the postal sorting facility. As he stood beside the overgrown mailbox, trying to understand how mail he had definitely delivered could have reappeared in perfect condition, Keisuke became aware of sounds coming from the direction of the abandoned house. At first, he thought he might be hearing the normal sounds of a structure settling or animals that had taken up residence in the empty building. But as he listened more carefully, he began to pick out distinctly human sounds of footsteps moving through the house, doors opening and closing, and what sounded like quiet conversations between multiple people. The sounds were particularly puzzling because the house had been empty for months, with all utilities disconnected and the family's belongings removed by professional movers. Keisuke had watched the moving process himself, helping to carry some of the heavier items to the truck, and he was certain that the building was completely vacant. Yet the sounds suggested that not only was someone living in the house, but that it was occupied by a family with children, based on the light footsteps and occasional high-pitched voices that carried through the morning air. Curious and somewhat concerned that squatters might have moved into the abandoned property, Keisuke decided to investigate more closely. The house was a traditional rural structure, built in the early 1970s with the kind of practical design that prioritized function over aesthetics. It had been well maintained by its previous occupants, but months of abandonment had already begun to show in peeling paint, overgrown landscaping, and windows that were clouded with dust and debris. As he approached the front entrance, the sounds from inside the house became more distinct and more disturbing. He could hear what sounded like a family engaged in normal daily activities, children playing games, adults having conversations, the clatter of dishes and household objects being used. But there was something artificial about the sounds, as if they were being produced by people who were trying to recreate the activities of family life without fully understanding how real families actually interacted. When Keisuke peered through one of the ground floor windows, what he saw inside the house made his blood run cold. The rooms that should have been empty were furnished with what appeared to be the original family's belongings. Furniture, decorations, personal items, and children's toys that he had watched being loaded onto the moving truck months earlier. Everything was arranged exactly as it had been when the house was occupied, as if the family had never left and were continuing their normal routines in the abandoned structure. But the figures moving through the furnished rooms were not the family members he remembered. Instead, he saw translucent shapes that flickered in and out of visibility, phantom forms that seemed to be reenacting the daily activities of the departed family without actually being them. Some of the ghostly figures appeared to be adults going through the motions of cooking, cleaning, and other household tasks. Others were clearly children, playing with toys and games that cast no shadows and made no sound despite their obvious interaction with the spectral playthings. Most disturbing of all, the phantom children were all missing their hands. Their small arms ended in smooth stumps, and they moved their toys and games through some form of telekinetic manipulation rather than physical contact. The handless children seemed frustrated by their inability to properly grasp objects, repeatedly trying to pick up toys that would slip away from their incorporeal touch, their translucent faces showing expressions of confusion and sadness that spoke of needs that could never be satisfied. As Keisuke watched the impossible scene through the dusty window, one of the phantom children turned toward him and seemed to see him looking into the house. The ghostly child moved to the window and pressed its face against the glass from the inside, its mouth moving in what appeared to be speech, but producing no sound that Keisuke could hear. The child's expression was desperate and pleading, as if it was trying to communicate something urgently important, but was unable to make itself heard or understood. The child was joined at the window by other phantom figures, more handless children and adults whose faces showed the same desperate need to communicate with the living world. They pressed against the glass from inside the house, their translucent forms creating condensation patterns on the windows that looked disturbingly like handprints, despite the fact that none of the spectral figures possessed hands to make such marks. As the ghostly family gathered at the windows, Keisuke began to understand that they were not random spirits who had taken up residence in the abandoned house. They were somehow connected to the mail delivery process, to the letters and packages that continued to arrive for the departed family. The phantom figures were trying to maintain the illusion of normal family life in order to continue receiving mail, as if the delivery of letters and packages was somehow essential to their continued existence in the abandoned structure. The realization that he had been unknowingly feeding these hungry ghosts through his mail delivery activities made Keisuke step back from the window in horror. But as he turned to leave the property, he discovered that his postal truck would not start. The engine turned over normally, but the vehicle would not move, as if invisible hands were holding it in place or preventing the wheels from gaining traction on the gravel driveway. Looking back toward the house, Keisuke saw that all of the phantom figures had moved to the front windows and were watching him with desperate intensity. The handless children were making beckoning gestures with their stumps, trying to encourage him to return to the house and continue his mail delivery routine. The adult figures were pointing toward the mailbox, their translucent faces showing expressions of urgent need that suggested his departure would cause them significant distress. As he sat trapped in his immobilized truck, Keisuke began to hear voices coming from the direction of the house. The sounds were faint and distorted, like radio transmissions from a great distance, but he could make out fragments of desperate pleas for him to continue bringing them mail, to maintain the connection to the living world that his deliveries provided. "Please don't stop coming. We need the letters. Don't leave us alone." The phantom voices were joined by other sounds that made the situation even more terrifying. From somewhere deeper in the forest, Keisuke could hear what sounded like footsteps moving through the undergrowth, approaching the abandoned house from multiple directions. The footsteps were light and quick, like those of children running through the woods, but they were accompanied by other sounds that suggested the approaching figures were not entirely human, branches breaking under weights that seemed inconsistent with the lightness of the footsteps, and occasional glimpses of pale shapes moving between the trees. As the unseen figures drew closer to the house, the phantom family at the windows became more agitated. Their desperate gestures toward the mailbox became more frantic, and Keisuke could see that they were terrified of whatever was approaching through the forest. The handless children pressed their faces harder against the glass, their mouths open in what appeared to be silent screams of fear and desperation. The approaching footsteps reached the edge of the property, and Keisuke caught his first glimpse of what had been moving through the forest. Pale, translucent figures emerged from between the trees, more phantom children. But these were different from the ones inside the house. These spirits moved with predatory purpose, their handless arms reaching toward the house as if they were seeking to join the family that had taken up residence in the abandoned structure. But the children inside the house clearly did not want to be joined by the forest spirits. The phantom family began moving frantically through the rooms, as if they were trying to secure the house against invasion by the approaching entities. Furniture was moved to block doors and windows, and the adult figures positioned themselves between the children and the points of entry, despite their translucent state making any physical defense impossible. As more handless spirits emerged from the forest and surrounded the house, Keisuke began to understand the true horror of his situation. The abandoned houses along his route had become gathering points for the spirits of children who had died violently, lost souls who were drawn to places where normal family life had once existed. The phantom families that recreated domestic routines in the empty houses were trying to maintain barriers against these hungry ghosts, using the continued delivery of mail as a form of spiritual anchor that kept the more desperate spirits at bay. But the system was breaking down. As more houses along his route were abandoned and more phantom families took up residence in empty structures, the concentration of handless spirits in the area was increasing beyond what the artificial domestic scenes could contain. The forest was becoming crowded with desperate ghosts seeking incorporation into families that no longer existed, and their increasing numbers were overwhelming the defenses that the house-dwelling spirits had constructed. The handless spirits from the forest began to press against the windows and doors of the house, their translucent forms creating disturbing patterns of condensation as they tried to force their way inside. The phantom family fought back as best they could, but their incorporeal state limited their ability to create effective barriers against entities that were just as immaterial as they were themselves. As the spiritual battle raged around the abandoned house, Keisuke's truck suddenly lurched into motion, as if whatever had been holding it in place had been distracted by more pressing concerns. He immediately put the vehicle in reverse and began backing down the long driveway, desperate to escape the supernatural conflict before he became caught up in whatever was happening between the competing groups of spirits. But as he reached the main road and began driving away from the abandoned house, Keisuke realized that the handless spirits were not limited to the forest areas around individual properties. The entire stretch of road was becoming populated with pale, reaching figures that emerged from the treeline and followed his truck as he drove through their territory. Some ran alongside his vehicle with the jerky, unnatural gait of broken marionettes, while others seemed to float just above the road's surface, their translucent forms flickering in and out of visibility as they tried to keep pace with his escape. The pursuing spirits all showed the same characteristic damage: missing hands, traumatic injuries that spoke of violent deaths, and expressions of desperate hunger for something that the living world could provide, but that remained forever beyond their incorporeal reach. They called out to him as they gave chase, their voices blending into a chorus of need and desperation that echoed through the mountain valleys. "Bring us letters too. Don't forget about us. We want to have families too." Keisuke drove faster than was safe on the winding mountain roads, but the handless spirits matched his speed with supernatural ease. It wasn't until he reached the boundary of his delivery route and crossed into an area where he had never made regular deliveries that the pursuing ghosts finally stopped following him. They gathered at what appeared to be an invisible barrier, their translucent forms flickering with frustration and disappointment as they watched him escape their territorial claims. When he finally reached the safety of the main postal facility, Keisuke submitted a report requesting reassignment to a different delivery route, citing dangerous road conditions and concerns about his personal safety. He never mentioned the phantom families or the pursuing spirits, knowing that such claims would result in psychological evaluation rather than route reassignment. But he made sure that other postal workers knew to avoid the mountain roads in the Aokigahara region, creating a reputation that eventually led to the official suspension of mail delivery to the abandoned properties. Years later, when hikers and local authorities began reporting sightings of ghost families in abandoned houses throughout the region, Keisuke understood that the concentration of handless spirits had continued to grow beyond what any artificial domestic barriers could contain. The phantom children who had once been content to play at being members of normal families had become more aggressive in their attempts to recreate the human connections they had lost in death, and the mountain roads that had once been his peaceful delivery route had become highways for spirits seeking impossible reunions with a world that could no longer offer them the comfort and belonging they desperately craved. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes across the winding mountain pass that carved through Hokkaido's most remote wilderness. Kenji pressed his foot harder against the accelerator, his knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel of his rental car. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and he still had another 3 hours of driving ahead of him before reaching his hotel in Sapporo. The business conference had run later than expected, and now he found himself alone on these treacherous mountain roads in the middle of a blizzard. The windshield wipers struggled against the accumulating snow, their rhythmic scraping the only sound besides the low hum of the engine and the howling wind outside. Kenji had driven these roads before during his quarterly sales trips, but never in weather this severe. The visibility was nearly zero, forcing him to crawl along at barely 20 kilometers per hour. Every few minutes, he would pass a small reflector post marking the edge of the road, the only indication that he hadn't veered off into the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly on both sides. As he rounded a particularly sharp curve, his headlights illuminated something that made his heart skip a beat. There, standing motionless on the side of the road, was a small figure bundled in winter clothing. At first glance, it appeared to be a child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with their thumb extended in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. Kenji immediately began to slow down, his mind racing with concern. What was a child doing out here alone in the middle of a blizzard? The nearest town was at least 50 kilometers away, and the temperature outside was well below freezing. He pulled his car to a stop about 10 meters past the figure and put it in park, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the small form still standing there, unmoving despite the swirling snow and bitter wind. Something about the scene struck him as odd. The child wasn't shivering, wasn't moving at all actually. They just stood there with their thumb extended, as still as a statue. Kenji grabbed his winter coat from the passenger seat and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him immediately, cutting through his clothing like knives of ice. Snow stung his face and made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He trudged through the ankle-deep snow toward the figure, calling out as he approached, "Hey, are you all right? What are you doing out here?" His voice was nearly lost in the howling wind. As he got closer, he could make out more details about the child. They were wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned winter kimono, dark blue with white patterns that seemed to shift and move in the swirling snow. Their head was covered by a hood, casting their face in deep shadow. When Kenji was about 5 meters away, he called out again, "Do you need help? Are you lost?" Still no response. The child remained perfectly motionless, their arm extended with the thumb up, as if frozen in time. It was then that Kenji noticed something that made his blood run cold. Despite the fact that snow was falling heavily all around them, none of it seemed to be accumulating on the child's clothing or body. The snow simply passed through them as if they weren't really there. He stopped in his tracks, his breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air as panic began to set in. "Who are you?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure why he was whispering. Something deep in his primitive brain was screaming at him to run, to get back in the car and drive away as fast as the icy roads would allow. But curiosity and concern for what he still hoped might be a lost child kept his feet planted in the snow. The figure slowly began to turn toward him. The movement was unnatural, mechanical, like a doll being rotated by invisible hands. As they turned, Kenji could see that where the child's face should have been, there was only darkness beneath the hood. But it was what he saw extending from the sleeve of the kimono that made him stumble backward in terror. Instead of a normal arm and hand, a small, pale hand was floating independently in the air where the child's arm should be. The hand was ghostly white, almost translucent, with tiny fingers that moved with their own horrible life. It wasn't attached to anything. It was just there, floating, the thumb still extended in that hitchhiking gesture. But now Kenji could see that the other fingers were curled into unnatural positions, as if they had been broken and never properly healed. The disembodied hand began to move toward him, floating through the air at about chest height. As it approached, Kenji could hear a sound that made his skin crawl, the soft, wet sound of flesh slapping against itself, as if the hand was trying to clap but couldn't quite manage to bring the fingers together properly. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, and utterly terrifying. Kenji wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The hand was now only a meter away from him, and he could see details that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The skin was mottled and pale, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. The fingernails were long and yellow, more like claws than human nails. Most disturbing of all, there appeared to be bite marks on the wrist area where the hand had been severed from whatever body it had once belonged to. As the hand drew closer, Kenji began to feel a strange tingling sensation in his own hands. He looked down and gasped in horror. His own hands were becoming pale and translucent, just like the ghostly appendage floating before him. The feeling was spreading up his arms, a cold, numbing sensation that felt like his very life force was being drained away. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The floating hand was now so close that he could feel its cold presence against his chest. It began to circle around him, leaving a trail of icy air in its wake. Each time it passed in front of his face, he caught a glimpse of something written on the palm in what looked like dried blood. The characters were in an ancient form of Japanese that he couldn't read, but somehow he understood their meaning. "Give me your hands." The spell was broken when a truck's horn blared in the distance, the sound echoing off the mountain walls. Kenji's paralysis shattered, and he found himself running through the deep snow toward his car, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him through the drifts. Behind him, he could hear the wet slapping sound growing louder, as if the hand was pursuing him. He reached his car and threw himself inside, slamming the door and immediately locking it. His hands were shaking so violently that it took 3 tries to get the car into gear. As he pressed the accelerator and began to drive away, he looked in his rearview mirror one last time. The small figure in the kimono was still standing there, but now both arms were extended, and Kenji could see that both hands were floating free from the sleeves, drifting through the snow like ghostly butterflies. He drove through the night without stopping, reaching Sapporo just as the sun began to rise over the mountains. It wasn't until he was safely in his hotel room that he allowed himself to examine his hands carefully. They appeared normal, but when he held them up to the light, he could swear he saw something written across his palms in faint, barely visible characters. And sometimes, late at night when he was trying to fall asleep, he could still hear the soft, wet sound of disembodied hands trying to clap together in the darkness. Years later, Kenji would learn about the legend of Akateko, the red child's hand that appears to travelers on lonely roads. According to the folklore, those who encounter Akateko and live to tell about it are forever marked, carrying a piece of the spirit with them wherever they go. But the stories never mention what happens to those who don't escape, those who allow the ghostly hand to complete whatever dark purpose drives it to appear to lone travelers on cold, dark nights. Michiko had always prided herself on being a practical woman, someone who dealt in facts and figures rather than superstitions and ghost stories. As a data analyst for one of Tokyo's largest corporations, she spent her days immersed in spreadsheets and statistical models, finding comfort in the predictable patterns of numbers and the logical progression of cause and effect. So when her elderly grandmother had insisted that she visit the old family tea house deep in Kyoto's famous bamboo forest during her week-long vacation, Michiko had agreed more out of duty than any real desire to reconnect with her ancestral roots. The tea house had been in her family for 6 generations, passed down from mother to daughter along with the traditional recipes and ceremonial practices that had defined their family's identity for centuries. But it had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, ever since her great-aunt Yuki had simply disappeared one autumn night, leaving behind only a cryptic note about the small hands that serve in darkness. The local authorities had conducted a thorough search, but no trace of the elderly woman had ever been found. After that, none of the family members had been willing to maintain the property, and it had gradually fallen into disrepair. The path through the bamboo forest was narrower and more overgrown than Michiko had expected. Ancient bamboo stalks rose like cathedral columns on both sides of the trail, their leaves whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand as the evening breeze rustled through them. The sound was oddly soothing at first, like gentle rain on a tin roof, but as she walked deeper into the forest, it began to take on a more ominous quality. The whispers seemed to be following her, always just behind her shoulder, as if the bamboo itself was aware of her presence and was discussing her arrival in hushed, conspiratorial tones. The sun was setting by the time she reached the clearing where the tea house sat, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden structure. The building was smaller than she had imagined, a traditional single-room construction with sliding paper doors and a steep tiled roof that had seen better days. Several tiles were missing, and moss had begun to claim the wooden walls, giving the structure an abandoned, melancholy appearance that spoke of years of neglect and the relentless passage of time. Michiko had brought a battery-powered lantern and some basic supplies for cleaning, planning to spend the evening getting the place ready for a more thorough restoration effort the following week. She slid open the front door, wincing as it squeaked on its ancient tracks, and stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, protected from the elements by the solid construction and the canopy of bamboo that surrounded the clearing. Dust particles danced in the beam of her lantern, creating ghostly patterns in the air as she moved through the space. The main room contained all the traditional elements of a proper tea house: low wooden tables, cushions for seating, shelves lined with ceramic vessels and implements, and in the center of the room, a sunken hearth where water would have been heated for the tea ceremony. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but underneath, Michiko could see that the craftsmanship was exquisite. Her ancestors had clearly been skilled artisans who took great pride in their work. She set her lantern on one of the low tables and began to explore the space more thoroughly. In one corner, she found a collection of old photograph albums wrapped in silk cloth. As she carefully opened the first album, she saw dozens of images dating back to the early 1900s, showing her ancestors conducting tea ceremonies for what appeared to be wealthy clients and dignitaries. The photographs were remarkably well preserved, and she found herself fascinated by the formal poses and elaborate kimonos worn by the participants. It was while she was examining a particular photograph from the 1920s that she first noticed something odd. In the background of the image, partially obscured by the shadows near the serving area, there appeared to be a small hand reaching around the edge of a cabinet. The hand was pale and looked like it belonged to a child, but there were no children visible in the photograph. Moreover, the angle of the hand was wrong. It appeared to be floating independently, not attached to any body that might be hidden behind the cabinet. Michiko held the photograph closer to the lantern light, studying the anomaly more carefully. The more she looked at it, the more convinced she became that there was something unnatural about the image. The hand appeared to be holding a small teacup, but the cup itself seemed to be floating as well, suspended in midair with no visible means of support. She flipped through several more photographs and found similar anomalies in about half of them. Always the same pale, childlike hand appearing in shadows or at the edges of the frame, sometimes holding objects, sometimes simply reaching toward the camera with its tiny fingers extended. As she continued to examine the photographs, Michiko became aware of a sound coming from somewhere else in the tea house. It was soft and rhythmic, like someone gently tapping their fingers on wood. At first, she thought it might be a branch brushing against the roof in the wind, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful to be random. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the serving area, a small adjoining room where tea would have been prepared before being brought out to the guests. She stood up and walked toward the sound, her footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors. The serving area was even smaller than the main room, with built-in shelves lining the walls and a long, low counter where the tea preparation would have taken place. The tapping sound grew louder as she approached, and she could now tell that it was definitely coming from inside the room. Michiko paused at the entrance to the serving area, her lantern held high to illuminate the space. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Dusty shelves, old ceramic implements, cobwebs hanging from the corners like gossamer curtains. But the tapping continued, a steady rhythm that seemed almost like a code or a form of communication. She stepped into the room and began to search for the source of the sound. It was then that she saw it. On the main preparation counter, a small teacup was moving by itself, sliding back and forth across the wooden surface in short, jerky movements. Each time it moved, it made a soft tapping sound as it contacted the wood. But what made Michiko's blood freeze was the sight of what was moving the cup. A pale, translucent hand, no larger than that of a 6-year-old child, was gripping the handle of the cup and methodically sliding it back and forth. The hand appeared to be completely independent, with no arm or body attached to it. It moved with its own purpose and intelligence, the tiny fingers delicately manipulating the cup as if conducting some sort of ritual or ceremony. The skin was ghostly white, almost transparent, and Michiko could see what looked like veins or dark lines running beneath the surface. Most disturbing of all, the hand bore what appeared to be teeth marks around the wrist area, as if it had been severed from its original body by something with very sharp teeth. As Michiko watched in horrified fascination, the hand suddenly stopped its movements and turned toward her, as if it had suddenly become aware of her presence. The tiny fingers released the cup and began to move in what looked like a beckoning gesture, inviting her to come closer. She wanted to run, every instinct screaming at her to flee this cursed place, but she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the impossible sight before her. The hand began to move across the counter toward her, its movements surprisingly graceful for something so unnatural. As it drew closer, Michiko could hear a sound that made her skin crawl, a soft, childlike giggling that seemed to be coming from the hand itself, though it had no mouth or vocal cords. The sound was innocent and playful, but in this context, it was utterly terrifying. When the hand reached the edge of the counter, It paused for a moment, and then began to float through the air toward Michiko. As it approached, she noticed that it left no shadow despite the bright beam of her lantern, and the air around it seemed to shimmer and distort, as if the very fabric of reality was being bent by its presence. The giggling grew louder, more insistent, and was joined by other sounds: the soft rustle of silk, the gentle clink of porcelain, and what sounded like whispered conversations in an ancient dialect of Japanese. Suddenly, the small hand was joined by others. They seemed to materialize out of thin air, floating down from the ceiling like leaves falling from a tree. Some were pale and childlike like the first, others were larger and appeared to belong to adults. All of them showed signs of violent separation from their original bodies: ragged tears, bite marks, burn scars. They moved through the air with their own purpose, some reaching toward Michiko with grasping fingers, others seeming to reenact the motions of serving tea or conducting ceremony. Michiko found her voice and screamed, the sound echoing through the small tea house and seemingly absorbed by the bamboo forest beyond. The hands paused in their movements, as if startled by the sound, and in that moment of hesitation, she was able to break free from her paralysis. She turned and ran toward the main door, her lantern swinging wildly and casting crazy shadows on the walls. Behind her, she could hear the sound of dozens of disembodied hands clapping together in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. The sound followed her as she fled through the bamboo forest, crashing through the undergrowth and stumbling over roots in her desperate attempt to escape. It wasn't until she reached her car and was driving back toward the city that the clapping finally faded away, replaced by the normal sounds of traffic and civilization. The next morning, Michiko called her grandmother and told her that the tea house was too damaged to be restored, that it would be better to simply let nature reclaim it. She never mentioned what she had really seen that night, and she never returned to the bamboo forest. But sometimes, when she was working late in her office and the building was quiet and empty, she would hear the soft sound of hands clapping in applause, as if invisible spectators were appreciating her work from the shadows. The trail to the abandoned shrine on Mount Fuji's northeastern slope was not marked on any official hiking maps, and for good reason. Local rangers had stopped maintaining the path decades ago after a series of inexplicable incidents involving hikers who claimed to have encountered impossible things near the old temple complex. But Takashi Yamamoto was not easily deterred by local superstitions or bureaucratic caution. As a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned places, he had made his career documenting forgotten corners of Japan, and the rumors surrounding this particular location only made it more appealing to his professional sensibilities. He had first learned about the shrine from an elderly man in a sake bar in Kawaguchi-kyo, who had insisted that the temple held secrets dating back to the Edo period, when it had served as a sanctuary for those seeking purification before attempting to climb the sacred mountain. According to the old man's rambling account, the shrine had been abandoned suddenly in 1923, not because of the Great Kanto earthquake that devastated much of the region, but because of something far more disturbing that the local monks refused to discuss with outsiders. The hike took Takashi most of the morning, following an increasingly faint trail through dense forest that showed no signs of recent human passage. The trees grew thicker and more twisted as he climbed higher, their branches forming a canopy so dense that even the midday sun barely penetrated to the forest floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional distant call of a bird that seemed to echo strangely in the thick air. When he finally reached the shrine complex, Takashi was struck by how well-preserved the buildings were despite decades of abandonment. The main hall, with its distinctive curved roofline and weathered wooden pillars, stood surrounded by several smaller structures that had once housed monks and served various ceremonial functions. Red torii gates marked the entrance to the complex, their paint faded but still visible, creating a stark contrast against the dark green of the surrounding forest. Takashi spent the first hour of his visit setting up his equipment and taking establishing shots of the exterior structures. The late afternoon light filtering through the trees created dramatic shadows and gave the abandoned buildings an otherworldly quality that would translate beautifully to film. But it was when he entered the main hall that he discovered something that made him pause in his photographic work and examine his surroundings more carefully. The interior of the temple was immaculate, not just well-preserved, but actually clean, as if someone had been maintaining it regularly. The wooden floors gleamed with fresh polish, the brass fittings on the altar showed no signs of tarnish, and the air carried the faint scent of incense, suggesting recent ceremonial activity. Most puzzling of all, fresh offerings sat before the main shrine, rice, fruit, and sake that appeared to have been placed there within the last few days. Takashi photographed the anomaly, wondering who might be making the journey to this remote location to maintain the shrine. Perhaps there was a caretaker living nearby, or maybe local villagers still made periodic pilgrimages despite the official abandonment of the site. He made a mental note to ask about it when he returned to town, but for now, he was more interested in documenting the mysterious preservation of this forgotten place. As he worked deeper into the temple complex, photographing the smaller buildings and ceremonial spaces, Takashi began to notice other oddities. In several of the rooms, he found what appeared to be child-sized handprints pressed into surfaces where they shouldn't logically appear, high on walls, on the undersides of low tables, on the inner surfaces of ceremonial boxes that would have been kept closed. The prints were made in what looked like red clay or perhaps dried blood, and they appeared to be fresh despite the obvious age of the buildings. The strangest discovery came when he entered what had once been the monks' living quarters. In the main room, arranged in a perfect circle on the tatami mats, were dozens of small wooden bowls. Each bowl contained what appeared to be rice and vegetables, as if someone had prepared individual meals for a large group of very small diners. But the portions were far too small for adult monks, and the arrangement suggested something more ritualistic than simply feeding hungry people. Takashi was photographing the unusual meal arrangement when he heard footsteps coming from elsewhere in the building. The sound was distinctive, not the heavy tread of an adult, but the light, quick steps of a child running across wooden floors. He called out, announcing his presence and asking if anyone was there, but received no response. The footsteps continued, seeming to move from room to room through the building, always just out of sight. Curious and slightly concerned, Takashi followed the sound of the footsteps, his camera ready in case he encountered whoever was sharing the temple with him. The sounds led him deeper into the residential complex, through rooms that grew progressively darker as the afternoon sun began to set behind the mountain peaks. The footsteps always seemed to be just ahead of him, just around the next corner, but no matter how quickly he moved, he never caught sight of their source. It was in the last room of the residential building that Takashi discovered something that made him question his own sanity. The room was small and appeared to have once been used for meditation, with a single cushion placed before a simple wooden altar. But covering every surface of the room, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor around the meditation cushion, were hundreds of small handprints, all made in the same red substance he had seen elsewhere in the complex. The handprints were arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if they were telling a story or conveying a message that he couldn't decipher. Some were clustered together in groups, others formed flowing lines that circled the room like a macabre dance. Most disturbing of all, the handprints appeared to be moving, not dramatically, but with a subtle shifting motion that became apparent when he watched them from the corner of his eye. They seemed to pulse and flow like living things, rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. As Takashi stood transfixed by the impossible sight, he became aware of a new sound, soft giggling that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The laughter was childlike and innocent, but in the context of this haunted place, it sent chills down his spine. The giggling grew louder and was joined by other sounds, whispered conversations in what sounded like children's voices, the soft patting of small hands clapping together, and a rhythmic tapping that seemed to match his own rapidly beating heart. He raised his camera to photograph the handprints, but when he looked through the viewfinder, he saw something that made him lower the camera immediately and step backward toward the door. The handprints were no longer just marks on the wall. They were reaching outward, becoming three-dimensional, as if actual hands were pushing through the surface of the walls and trying to emerge into the room with him. The giggling grew louder, more insistent, and Takashi could now see that the hands were becoming more defined, more real with each passing second. Tiny fingers wiggled and grasped at the air, as if testing their newfound dimensionality. Some of the hands appeared to be completely normal, pale and child-sized, while others showed signs of injury or decay, broken fingers, torn flesh, stains that could only be dried blood. As the hands continued to emerge from the walls, Takashi realized with growing horror that they were all reaching toward him, their tiny fingers beckoning him to come closer. The whispered conversations grew more distinct, and he began to pick out individual words in an archaic form of Japanese that he could barely understand. They seemed to be calling his name, asking him to join them, to add his own handprints to their eternal collection. The spell was broken when one of the hands, larger than the others and belonging to what might have been a teenager, managed to push completely through the wall and grab at his camera strap. The touch was ice cold and sent a shock of electric pain up his arm, breaking him out of his horrified trance. He yanked the camera free and ran from the room, crashing through the temple complex as the sound of children's laughter echoed around him like a chorus of the damned. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, hours later and completely out of breath. His hands were shaking so badly that it took several attempts to get the key into the ignition, and even then, he sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, trying to convince himself that what he had experienced was just some sort of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much time spent in isolated places. It wasn't until he developed his photographs the following week that Takashi realized the true horror of his experience. In every single image he had taken inside the temple, there were additional details that he hadn't noticed while shooting, small hands reaching into the frame from impossible angles, child-sized shadows that fell in directions inconsistent with the lighting, and in the background of several shots, the translucent figures of children who appeared to be missing their hands entirely, standing with their arms raised as if reaching for something just beyond the edge of the photograph. He never published the photographs, and he never returned to that part of Mount Fuji. But sometimes, late at night when he was alone in his darkroom, he would hear the soft sound of small hands tapping against the walls, as if the children from the abandoned shrine had followed him home and were patiently waiting for him to develop just one more roll of film from their haunted sanctuary. The Yamanote line carried millions of passengers through Tokyo every day, but few of them knew about the abandoned station that existed between Shimbashi and Hamamatsucho, hidden beneath the city like a forgotten piece of history. Yuki Tanaka had discovered its existence purely by accident while researching her master's thesis on urban development patterns in post-war Japan. A single reference in a 1960s municipal planning document had mentioned the temporary closure of Shiodome Station pending safety improvements, but no subsequent records existed of the station ever reopening or being officially decommissioned. As an urban explorer with a particular fascination for Tokyo's hidden spaces, Yuki had spent weeks researching the station's location and planning her infiltration. The entrance she had identified was through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the active rail system, accessible through a service ladder in one of the newer Shiodome office buildings. It would be dangerous and certainly illegal, but the opportunity to document a completely forgotten piece of Tokyo's infrastructure was too tempting to pass up. She had chosen to make her exploration on a Tuesday night, when the train stopped running and the maintenance crews would be working on other sections of the line. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying only a small backpack with her camera equipment and emergency supplies, Yuki descended into the maze of tunnels that ran beneath one of the world's most densely populated cities. The transition from the modern, brightly lit office building to the dark, humid tunnels was jarring, like stepping back in time to a version of Tokyo that had been forgotten by progress. The maintenance tunnel was narrower than she had expected, forcing her to crouch as she made her way through the darkness with only a small flashlight to guide her path. The air was thick with moisture and carried the distinctive metallic smell of underground railways mixed with something else, a musty, organic odor that reminded her of flowers left too long in stagnant water. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, creating a rhythmic soundtrack that echoed strangely in the confined space. After 20 minutes of careful navigation through branching tunnels and over obstacles of cables and pipe work, Yuki finally found what she was looking for. A rusted iron door marked with faded Japanese characters that read, "Platform Access. Authorized personnel only." The door was unlocked, its hinges protesting with a harsh squeal as she pushed it open and stepped into a space that hadn't seen visitors in decades. The abandoned platform stretched out before her like a scene from a post-apocalyptic film. The station had clearly been elegant once, with Art Deco details and marble accents that spoke of the optimistic modernization efforts of the early 1960s. But time and neglect had transformed it into something far more ominous. The ceiling tiles had fallen in many places, creating treacherous piles of debris on the platform. The walls were streaked with water damage and covered in a fuzzy growth of mold that seemed to move and shift in the beam of her flashlight. Most unsettling of all, the station showed signs of recent human presence despite its official abandonment. Fresh graffiti covered some of the walls, but not the usual tags and artwork that urban explorers typically left behind. Instead, someone had painted hundreds of small handprints in red paint across every available surface. The handprints were all roughly the same size, as if made by children around 6 or 7 years old, and they covered the walls from floor to ceiling in dense, overlapping patterns that made the entire space feel alive and watching. Yuki began photographing the unusual artwork, fascinated by the dedication and effort that would have been required to create such an extensive installation in this remote location. The handprints weren't random. They formed patterns and seemed to flow across the surfaces like frozen rivers of red. Some areas had so many overlapping prints that they created solid blocks of color, while others showed careful spacing that created the illusion of movement and flow. As she worked deeper into the station, documenting the abandoned ticket booth and the elegant staircase that led to what had once been the street entrance, Yuki began to hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible in this sealed, forgotten space. At first, it was just the distant rumble that could have been trains running on nearby active lines. But gradually, she became aware of more specific sounds of the hiss of pneumatic doors opening and closing, the electronic chime that announced arriving trains, and most distinctly, the sound of footsteps on the platform behind her. She turned to look, but saw nothing except the empty platform stretching back toward the tunnel entrance. The footsteps continued, a soft pattering sound like children running in bare feet across wet pavement. The sound seemed to be moving around her, sometimes to her left, sometimes behind her, but always just out of sight when she turned to look. It was as if invisible passengers were boarding and departing from trains that no longer existed, following the routines of daily commuting in a station that time had forgotten. The most disturbing moment came when Yuki was photographing the far end of the platform, where the tunnel entrance would have allowed trains to enter and exit the station. As she framed her shot, she became aware of a soft rushing sound, like wind moving through a confined space. The sound grew louder and was accompanied by the distinctive clacking rhythm of train wheels on rails, approaching from the darkness of the tunnel. She lowered her camera and stared into the tunnel mouth, her flashlight beam swallowed by the absolute darkness beyond. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, more distinct, and she could now hear the electronic announcement system crackling to life with a garbled message in Japanese. The voice was distorted and unclear, but she could make out fragments. Next stop, Shizuoka Station. Please stand clear of the closing doors. As the phantom train drew closer, Yuki noticed that something was wrong with the sound. Mixed in with the mechanical noises of wheels and brakes, she could hear other sounds that made no sense: children laughing and singing, the soft clapping of small hands, and a rhythmic tapping that seemed to match her own frightened heart. The air in the station began to move, stirred by the approach of something large and fast, and she could smell the distinctive electrical ozone scent of the Tokyo rail system. But when the invisible train finally arrived at the platform, Yuki saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The red handprints that covered the walls began to move, sliding across the surfaces like living things seeking escape from their painted prison. Some of them pulled away from the walls entirely, becoming three-dimensional as pale, childlike hands reached into the space of the platform. The hands moved with purpose, some reaching toward the edge of the platform as if to board the phantom train, others beckoning to Yuki with tiny, grasping fingers. The sound of doors opening filled the station, and Yuki watched in terror as dozens of disembodied hands floated through the air toward where the train doors would have been. The hands were transparent but clearly defined, some pale and perfect, others showing signs of injury or decay. They moved in single file, orderly and patient, as if waiting their turn to board transportation to destinations unknown. As the phantom boarding process continued, Yuki became aware that some of the hands were turning toward her, their tiny fingers pointing in her direction. The children's laughter grew louder, more insistent, and she began to hear voices calling her name, inviting her to join them on their eternal journey through the forgotten corners of Tokyo's underground. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel invisible fingers tugging at her clothing, trying to guide her toward the edge of the platform. The sound of closing doors broke the spell, and Yuki found herself running back toward the tunnel entrance as the phantom train began to depart the station. Behind her, she could hear the disappointed cries of the children whose hands had been left behind, their voices echoing in the abandoned space like the calls of lost souls seeking passage to wherever it was they needed to go. She didn't stop running until she reached the surface, emerging from the office building into the bright lights and reassuring noise of Tokyo at night. The contrast between the bustling city and the haunted silence of the abandoned station was so stark that she almost convinced herself that the entire experience had been some sort of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much time spent in dark, confined spaces. But when she developed her photographs a few days later, Yuki discovered that her camera had captured things that she hadn't noticed while shooting. In several of the images, there were additional handprints that appeared to be floating in midair, disconnected from any surface. In one particularly disturbing photograph of the platform, she could see the translucent outline of what appeared to be a train car, with rows of small hands pressed against the windows from the inside, as if passengers were waving goodbye to someone on the platform. She never published her research on the abandoned station, and she gave up urban exploration entirely after that night. But sometimes, when she was riding the Yamanote line during her daily commute, she would feel the train slow down slightly as it passed between Shimbashi and Hamamitsucho, and she would hear the faint sound of children singing coming from somewhere beneath the floor of the car, as if the phantom passengers were still making their eternal journey through Tokyo's hidden underground, forever trying to reach a destination that existed only in the spaces between the living world and whatever lay beyond. The rental listing for the Seaside art studio in Kamakura had seemed too good to be true, and now, 3 weeks into her residency, Haruka Miyazaki was beginning to understand why the price had been so remarkably affordable. The traditional wooden building sat perched on a cliff overlooking Sagami Bay, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided breathtaking views of the ocean and the ancient temples that dotted the hillsides of the historic city. By all accounts, it should have been the perfect retreat for an artist seeking inspiration and solitude. But there were aspects of the studio that the rental agent had failed to mention, details that became more apparent as Haruka settled into her daily routine of painting and meditation. The first oddity she had noticed was the collection of unfinished paintings stacked against one wall of the main studio space. The canvases ranged from traditional landscapes to abstract expressionist works, all bearing the distinctive brushstrokes and color palettes of different artists. When she had asked the property manager about them, she had been told that they were left behind by previous residents and that she was welcome to dispose of them if they were taking up needed space. But something about the paintings intrigued her, and she had spent several evenings studying them, trying to understand the various artistic visions they represented. What struck her as particularly unusual was that despite the diverse styles and subjects of the paintings, they all shared one common element. Somewhere in each composition, often hidden in shadows or backgrounds, was the image of a small, pale hand reaching into the frame. Sometimes the hand was barely visible, suggested by a few subtle brushstrokes that could have been mistaken for branches or fabric. Other times, it was more prominent, rendered with careful attention to detail that made the tiny fingers seem almost alive on the canvas. Haruka had initially assumed that the recurring hand motif was some sort of artistic signature or inside joke among the previous residents. But as she examined the paintings more carefully, she began to notice that the hands seemed to be painted by a different artist than the rest of each composition. The technique was distinctly different, more primitive and childlike, as if someone very young had added the hands to finished paintings without the original artist's knowledge or permission. The studio itself was a masterpiece of traditional Japanese architecture, with soaring wooden beams, tatami mat floors, and sliding shoji screens that could be adjusted to control the natural light throughout the day. The main workspace was spacious enough for large canvases, with built-in storage for supplies and a small adjoining room that served as living quarters. Everything about the space should have been conducive to creative work, and indeed, Haruka found herself painting with an energy and focus that she hadn't experienced in years. But it was during the quiet evening hours, after the sun had set over Sagami Bay and the studio was illuminated only by her work lights, that strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small disturbances, paint tubes that moved from where she had left them, brushes that appeared cleaned and arranged when she was certain she had left them dirty, canvases that seemed to have been adjusted on their easels when she wasn't looking. She attributed these incidents to fatigue or distraction, the natural absent-mindedness that often accompanied intense creative periods. The first undeniably supernatural event occurred during her third week in the studio. Haruka had been working late on a seascape, trying to capture the particular quality of moonlight on water that she could see through the large windows. She had stepped away from her easel to mix a new color on her palette, and when she turned back to the canvas, she discovered that someone had added to her painting. In the lower right corner, where she had painted dark rocks emerging from the surf, a small hand now appeared to be reaching up out of the water, its pale fingers breaking the surface tension in a gesture that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The addition was skillfully executed, matching her own brushwork so closely that it appeared to be part of the original composition. But Haruka knew with absolute certainty that she had not painted the hand. She was alone in the studio, the doors were locked, and she had been working on that section of the canvas just moments before. Yet there it was, painted in her own style with her own paints, as if her hand had been guided by someone else's artistic vision. Over the following nights, similar additions appeared on her other works in progress. A landscape of the famous Kotokuin Buddha acquired a small handprint pressed into the base of the statue, as if a child had reached out to touch the ancient bronze during the painting process. A still life of flowers developed tiny fingerprints on the petals, so delicate and precisely rendered that they appeared to have been painted with a brush no larger than a single human hair. Each addition enhanced the emotional impact of the painting, while adding an element of mystery that Haruka found both fascinating and deeply troubling. She began staying up later, watching her canvases more carefully, trying to catch whatever was modifying her work in the act. But the additions only appeared when she looked away, always just outside her peripheral vision, as if the mysterious collaborator was playing an elaborate game of hide and seek with her artistic process. The more vigilant she became, the more clever the modifications seemed to be, appearing in places she hadn't expected and in ways that demonstrated an intimate understanding of her artistic intentions. It was during one of these late-night vigils that Haruka first saw the source of the mysterious additions to her paintings. She had been pretending to work on organizing her supplies while actually watching her latest canvas out of the corner of her eye, when she noticed a small movement near the easel. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light or perhaps a moth attracted to her work lamps. But as she continued to watch without turning her head directly toward the easel, she began to make out the shape of a tiny hand floating through the air near her painting. The hand was translucent but clearly defined, pale and childlike, moving with delicate precision as it held what appeared to be an impossibly small paintbrush. She watched in fascination and growing horror as the disembodied hand added subtle touches to her seascape, enhancing the play of light on water with brushstrokes that were somehow both tentative and expert. The hand worked quickly and efficiently, making improvements to her composition that she hadn't even realized were needed. When the hand finished its work, it paused for a moment, hovering near the canvas as if admiring the result. Then it turned toward Haruka, and she could see that it was making a gesture that looked like a wave, a friendly, childlike greeting that was both innocent and absolutely terrifying in this context. The hand seemed to be trying to communicate with her, to establish some sort of artistic rapport with the living artist whose work it had been silently improving. As the nights passed, more hands began to appear. They emerged from the shadows of the studio like shy children drawn to a source of warmth and creativity. Some were pale and perfect, others showed signs of age or injury, but all of them moved with the same purposeful artistic intent. They seemed to take turns working on her paintings, each adding their own unique touches and improvements to her compositions. She began to think of them as her invisible art students, eager to learn and contribute to the creative process. But there was something deeply unsettling about their presence that went beyond the simple impossibility of their existence. The hands never appeared together, never seemed to interact with each other, as if they were operating according to some sort of schedule or hierarchy that she couldn't understand. And sometimes, when she looked very carefully at her enhanced paintings, she could see what looked like tears or perhaps drops of blood mixed in with the paint, as if the artistic process was somehow painful for the ghostly collaborators. The most disturbing discovery came when she found a collection of sketches hidden behind one of the storage cabinets. The drawings were done in childlike styles, but they depicted scenes of violence and separation that no child should have been able to imagine. Image after image showed hands being severed from bodies, children reaching out desperately for help that never came, and artistic tools being used as instruments of harm rather than creation. The sketches were signed with tiny handprints instead of names, and the paper they were drawn on appeared to be very old, stained with substances that could have been either paint or something far more sinister. As Haruka studied the disturbing sketches, she began to understand that her invisible collaborators were not just artistic spirits drawn to creativity, but the remnants of something far more tragic. The hands that had been improving her paintings were all that remained of young artists whose lives had been cut short, who continued to seek creative expression even after death had separated them from their bodies and their dreams. The realization filled her with a mixture of compassion and terror that made it impossible for her to continue working in the studio. She began packing her supplies that very night, but as she prepared to leave, she felt tiny invisible fingers tugging at her clothing, trying to prevent her departure. The ghostly hands had become attached to her presence, to the opportunity she provided for continued artistic expression, and they were reluctant to let her go. She finally managed to escape the studio just before dawn, leaving behind several of her best paintings and most of her supplies. As she drove away from Kamakura, she could see in her rearview mirror what looked like dozens of small handprints pressed against the windows of the studio, as if her invisible collaborators were waving goodbye and hoping that she would return to continue their eternal artistic partnership. Haruka never painted again after that night, unable to look at a blank canvas without wondering whose ghostly hands might be waiting to add their own tragic touches to whatever she created. But sometimes, in galleries and museums, she would notice paintings that seemed to contain subtle additions that didn't quite match the original artist style. Tiny hands reaching into the composition from impossible angles, fingerprints that appeared to move when no one was looking directly at them, and the unmistakable sense that the artwork was somehow alive with the spirits of those who had died too young to fully express their artistic visions. The job posting for a night janitor position at Tenjin Elementary School in Osaka had been almost too easy to obtain, which should have been Kenji Nakamura's first warning that something was not quite right about the opportunity. The school had been officially closed for 3 years due to declining enrollment and budget cuts, but the municipal government still required basic maintenance to prevent vandalism and deterioration while they decided the building's ultimate fate. The pay was surprisingly generous for what seemed like straightforward custodial work, and the schedule midnight to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, suited Kenji's preference for solitude and his need to avoid the social interactions that had become so difficult since his wife's death. The building itself was a typical example of 1970s institutional architecture, a 3-story concrete structure with long corridors lined with classroom doors and windows that looked out onto a small playground and sports field. During the day, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the normal sounds of urban life filtering in from the surrounding neighborhood, the school probably felt perfectly ordinary. But at night, illuminated only by Kenji's flashlight and the occasional streetlight shining through the windows, it became something entirely different. A maze of shadows and echoes that seemed to hold memories of the thousands of children who had once filled its halls with laughter and learning. His duties were simple enough: basic cleaning of the main hallways and offices, checking for signs of break-ins or water damage, and ensuring that the building remained secure until morning. The school district had left most of the educational materials and furniture in place, apparently hoping that enrollment might recover enough to justify reopening the facility. This meant that the classrooms still contained desks arranged for students who would never return, bulletin boards decorated with artwork from children who had long since moved on to other schools, and chalkboards bearing the faint ghosts of lessons that would never be completed. Kenji found the work oddly soothing during his first few weeks on the job. The repetitive nature of cleaning and the familiar institutional smells of floor wax and disinfectant reminded him of his own elementary school days, bringing back memories of simpler times before life had become complicated by adult responsibilities and losses. He developed a routine that took him through the building methodically, starting with the main office and working his way up through each floor before finishing with the gymnasium and cafeteria areas. It was during his 3rd week that he first noticed something unusual about one of the first-floor classrooms. Room 108 had been set up for 2nd grade students, with low tables arranged in groups and educational posters covering the walls with hiragana characters and basic mathematical concepts. But unlike the other classrooms, which showed the normal signs of hasty abandonment, papers scattered on floors, supplies left on desks, chairs pushed back from tables at odd angles, room 108 was perfectly organized. The desks were arranged in precise rows, School supplies were neatly organized in their designated containers, and the chalkboard had been carefully cleaned and prepared for the next day's lessons. Kenji initially assumed that another employee had been assigned to maintain that particular classroom, perhaps for use by the district's administrative staff or as a community meeting space. But when he checked with his supervisor, he was told that no one else had access to the building during his shift, and that no special arrangements had been made for room 108. The supervisor seemed genuinely puzzled by Kenji's description of the classroom's condition and suggested that perhaps the previous tenant had simply been more organized than the others. Over the following nights, Kenji began paying closer attention to room 108 during his rounds. What he discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Each night, the classroom appeared to be in use despite the school's official abandonment. Fresh handwriting appeared on the chalkboard, simple math problems, and vocabulary exercises appropriate for second-grade students. The desks showed signs of recent use, with pencil shavings and eraser debris that hadn't been there the night before. Most mysteriously, student artwork appeared on the walls, crayon drawings and construction paper crafts that looked freshly made and carefully hung with tape that still had its full adhesive strength. The artwork was particularly intriguing because it was clearly the work of young children, displaying the characteristic proportions and color choices of early elementary students. But there was something subtly wrong about the drawings that became more apparent the more carefully Kenji studied them. Many of the pictures showed children playing or learning together, but the human figures in the drawings were missing their hands, just arms that ended in smooth stumps, as if the young artists had deliberately chosen not to include those particular body parts in their self-portraits. Even more disturbing were the handprints that appeared throughout the room. Unlike normal handprints that children might make with paint or ink as part of an art project, these prints appeared to be pressed directly into solid surfaces: the wooden desktops, the painted walls, even the glass of the windows. They were small, clearly made by children around 7 or 8 years old, but they appeared to have been created with some sort of red substance that could have been paint, clay, or something far more organic and disturbing. As Kenji continued his nightly observations of room 108, he began to hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible in the empty building. At first, it was just the subtle creaking and settling noises that any old building makes at night. But gradually, he began to pick out more specific sounds: the scraping of chairs being moved across the floor, the soft pattering of small feet running up and down the hallway, and most distinctly, the sound of children's voices engaged in lessons and play. The voices were faint and indistinct, like conversations overheard from another room or through thin walls. He could pick out fragments of typical classroom activities: students reciting multiplication tables, the sing-song rhythm of hiragana practice, the excited chatter of children working on group projects. But there was something artificial about the sounds, as if they were recordings being played back rather than genuine human voices, or perhaps echoes from the building's past that had somehow become trapped in its walls and corridors. The most unnerving aspect of these phantom classroom sounds was their timing. They only occurred during the hours when real classes would have been in session, never during lunch periods, recess times, or after-school hours. It was as if the ghostly students were following the same schedule that living children had once observed in the building, maintaining their educational routines even after death had freed them from the normal constraints of physical existence. One night during his 4th week on the job, Kenji decided to investigate the source of the sounds more directly. Instead of simply passing by room 108 during his regular rounds, he positioned himself outside the classroom door and listened carefully for any signs of activity within. What he heard made his blood run cold. The sounds of a full classroom in session were clearly audible through the door: children's voices answering questions, the scratch of pencils on paper, the gentle guidance of a teacher leading students through their lessons. But when he carefully opened the door and peered inside, the classroom was empty and silent, exactly as it had been every other night. The desks sat in their perfect rows, The chalkboard displayed its neat educational content, and fresh artwork decorated the walls. But there were no students, no teacher, no source for the sounds that had been so clear and distinct just moments before. The only sign that anything unusual had been happening was a new collection of handprints that had appeared on the windows since his last visit, dozens of small, red prints pressed against the glass as if children had been trying to look out at the night sky. As Kenji stood in the doorway of the empty classroom, he became aware of a new sound that made his skin crawl, soft giggling that seemed to be coming from all around him, echoing off the walls and ceiling in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. The laughter was innocent and playful, the kind of sound that should have brought back pleasant memories of childhood. But in the context of this abandoned school at 2 in the morning, it was utterly terrifying. The giggling grew louder and was joined by other sounds, the soft clapping of small hands, whispered conversations in children's voices, and a rhythmic tapping that could have been pencils drumming on desk tops or tiny fingers knocking against wood. The sounds seemed to be moving around the room, sometimes clustered near the teacher's desk, sometimes scattered among the student seating areas, as if invisible children were playing games that only they could see and understand. As Kenji watched in horrified fascination, he began to see movement in the classroom that defied rational explanation. The handprints on the windows started to shift and change, sliding across the glass surface like living things seeking escape from their transparent prison. Some of the prints pulled away from the windows entirely, becoming three-dimensional as pale, translucent hands floated through the air with their own purpose and intelligence. The disembodied hands were small and clearly belonged to children, but they moved with an urgency that suggested they were seeking something specific. Some of them reached toward the chalkboard, tiny fingers pointing at the educational content as if trying to participate in lessons they could no longer fully experience. Others drifted toward the student desks, attempting to grasp pencils and papers with fingers that could no longer manipulate physical objects in any meaningful way. Most disturbing of all, several of the hands turned toward Kenji himself, their tiny fingers beckoning to him in gestures that seemed both welcoming and desperately needy. The children's voices grew more distinct, and he began to pick out individual words and phrases. "Sensei, help us? We can't write without our hands. Please give us your hands so we can finish our lessons." The realization hit him like a physical blow. These weren't just the spirits of children who had died. They were the ghosts of students who had somehow lost their hands while still alive, who continued to seek education and normalcy even after death had claimed them. The perfect organization of room 108, the fresh artwork and handwriting, the phantom sounds of classroom activities. It was all part of their desperate attempt to continue their interrupted education, to complete lessons that had been cut short by whatever tragedy had befallen them. As this understanding dawned on him, the ghostly hands became more aggressive in their approach. They swarmed around him like a cloud of pale moths, their tiny fingers grasping at his own hands with increasing desperation. Where they touched him, his skin grew cold and numb, and he could feel his own life force being slowly drained away. The children's voices became more urgent, more demanding. "Share your hands with us? Just for tonight. We promise to give them back." But Kenji could see in the translucent faces that had begun to materialize around the floating hands that these were not promises the ghostly children could keep. Their eyes held the hollow desperation of souls trapped between worlds, seeking something they could never truly obtain. If he allowed them to take his hands, he would become just another spirit haunting room 108, forever trying to complete lessons that could never be finished. He backed away from the reaching hands, but found that the classroom door had somehow closed behind him, trapping him inside with the desperate spirits. The handprints on the walls began to pulse and glow with their own inner light, and the artwork on the bulletin board started to move and change, showing scenes of children reaching desperately for help that never came. their small faces twisted with fear and confusion as their hands were somehow taken from them. The ghostly children's voices rose to a crescendo of pleading and demand, and Kenji felt invisible fingers tugging at his clothing, trying to guide him toward one of the empty desks. They wanted him to sit down, to pick up a pencil, to become part of their eternal classroom where lessons never ended and homework was never complete. The floating hands pressed against his face and arms, leaving cold spots that felt like frostbite, marking him as their chosen substitute teacher in this nightmare academy. Just as he felt his will beginning to succumb to their desperate need, Kenji remembered the emergency key to the school's main entrance that he carried on his keychain. With tremendous effort, he pulled the keys from his pocket and hurled them as hard as he could at the classroom windows. The glass shattered with a crash that seemed to break the spell holding him, and the ghostly children's voices rose in a wail of disappointment and rage. The floating hands made one last desperate grab for him, but he was already running toward the broken window, cutting himself on the glass shards as he climbed through to the playground beyond. Behind him, he could hear the sound of dozens of small hands slapping against the remaining glass, trying to follow him into the night, but unable to leave the confines of their haunted classroom. Kenji ran through the empty streets of Osaka until his lungs burned and his legs could carry him no further. When he finally stopped, gasping for breath in the glow of a streetlight, he looked down at his own hands and saw that they were covered with small, pale handprints that hadn't been there before. The prints were cold to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence, as if the ghostly children had marked him as their property, claiming him for future visits to their eternal classroom. He never returned to Tenjin Elementary School, calling in sick for the remaining nights of his employment and eventually finding work as far from Osaka as he could manage. But the handprints never faded from his skin, and sometimes, late at night when he was trying to sleep, he could hear the faint sound of children's voices calling his name, inviting him back to room 108 where lessons were always in session and the students were always eager to learn from anyone willing to lend them a helping hand. The morning fog hung thick over Abashiri Harbor as Hiroshi Sato prepared his fishing boat for what would be his last solo trip before the winter season made the waters too dangerous for small vessel operations. At 63, he had been fishing these waters for more than 4 decades, and he knew every current, every rocky outcropping, and every seasonal pattern that determined where the fish would be running. But lately, something had been different about the harbor. Other fishermen had been reporting unusual catches, strange sounds coming from beneath the water, and an increasing reluctance among the local fishing fleet to venture out alone after sunset. Hiroshi had initially dismissed these concerns as the typical superstitions that plagued small fishing communities, the kind of folklore that grew more elaborate with each telling in the harbor's bars and coffee shops. But he had begun to notice changes in his own catches over the past few weeks: fish with unusual markings, nets that came up tangled in ways that suggested intelligent interference, and most disturbing of all, occasional glimpses of pale shapes moving beneath his boat in the dark water, shapes that were too large and too purposeful to be explained by normal marine life. The morning started normally enough. Hiroshi loaded his gear, checked his engine, and headed out into the bay just as the first rays of sunlight began to burn through the persistent fog. The water was unusually calm for late autumn, with only gentle swells that rocked his boat in a soothing rhythm that had lulled him to sleep on countless previous trips. He had planned to work the deeper waters about 5 kilometers offshore, where the bottom dropped away into trenches that had always been productive for the larger fish that commanded better prices in the Sapporo markets. By mid-morning, his luck seemed to be holding. His nets were coming up heavy with a good variety of fish, and the weather remained cooperative despite the threatening clouds that had been building on the northern horizon. But it was during his 3rd net haul of the day that Hiroshi discovered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about these familiar waters. Mixed in with the usual catch of cod and flounder, His net contained something that shouldn't have been possible. Scattered throughout the writhing mass of fish were dozens of small, pale objects that at first glance looked like dead jellyfish or perhaps pieces of discarded plastic. But as he began sorting through his catch, Hiroshi realized with growing horror that the objects were human hands, the small, delicate hands of children, perfectly preserved despite what must have been long submersion in the cold harbor water. The hands were all roughly the same size, as if they had belonged to children between 6 and 10 years old. Some still wore small rings or bracelets, tarnished but intact after their time in the sea. Most disturbing of all, the hands showed no signs of decomposition or marine damage. They looked as fresh and lifelike as if they had been severed from living children just moments before being caught in his net. Their skin still soft and their tiny fingernails still neatly trimmed. Hiroshi's first instinct was to throw the horrifying catch back into the water, but something made him pause. As he stared at the pale hands scattered across his deck, he noticed that they were all making the same gesture. Their tiny fingers were curved as if they had been grasping something when they were severed, and they were all oriented in the same direction, as if pointing towards something specific in the harbor. Following the direction indicated by the ghostly hands, Hiroshi looked out across the water toward the old section of the harbor, where abandoned piers and derelict buildings marked the remains of Abashiri's more prosperous fishing past. It was there, rising from the fog like something from a nightmare, that he saw the source of the harbor's recent strangeness. A ship that he had never seen before was anchored near the old piers, despite the fact that those waters were too shallow and too cluttered with debris to accommodate any vessel larger than a small fishing boat. The ship appeared to be very old, possibly dating to the early 20th century, with a design that suggested it had once been used for passenger service rather than commercial fishing. But what made the sight truly unnerving was the activity visible on the ship's deck. Through his binoculars, Hiroshi could see figures moving about on the vessel, but they moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes being controlled by inexpert puppeteers. As he watched, some of the figures appeared to be throwing objects overboard, objects that created small splashes in the water around the ship. Even from this distance, he could see that the objects being thrown were small and pale, roughly the same size and color as the hands he had found in his fishing net. The fog began to clear as the morning sun gained strength, and Hiroshi was able to get a better look at both the mysterious ship and the figures on its deck. What he saw made his blood run cold. The vessel was clearly ancient and showed signs of having been underwater for extended periods. Its hull was encrusted with marine growth, its superstructure was twisted and corroded, and water constantly poured from holes in its sides, yet it somehow remained afloat despite its obvious unseaworthiness. The figures on the deck were even more disturbing than the ghost ship itself. They appeared to be children, dozens of them, all wearing what looked like old-fashioned school uniforms that were soaked and torn. But as Hiroshi watched through his binoculars, he realized that something was horribly wrong with the children's appearances. They were all missing their hands, their arms ending in smooth stumps that they held up toward the sky as if reaching for something that remained forever beyond their grasp. The handless children moved in single file around the ship's deck, following some sort of ritual pattern that brought them to the rail where they would lean over and appear to be dropping something into the water. But since they had no hands with which to grasp objects, Hiroshi couldn't understand what they might be releasing into the harbor. It was only when he saw one of the children lean too far over the rail and tumble into the water that he understood the horrible truth. When the child hit the water, it didn't sink or swim away as a living person would. Instead, it seemed to dissolve, its form breaking apart into dozens of pale fragments that dispersed through the water like a school of ghostly fish. Some of the fragments sank into the depths, but others began swimming with purpose toward Hiroshi's boat, moving through the water with the undulating motion of disembodied hands propelling themselves through the sea. As more of the spectral children threw themselves from the deck of the ghost ship, the water around Hiroshi's boat became filled with swimming hands, all making their way toward his vessel with obvious intent. He tried to start his engine and flee the area, but the motor only coughed and sputtered, as if something in the water was interfering with its normal operation. The pale hands were now visible all around his boat, some floating on the surface, others moving beneath the hull like a school of predatory fish. The first hand to reach his boat pulled itself up over the side with its tiny fingers, moving like a pale spider as it scuttled across the deck toward where Hiroshi stood frozen with terror. The hand was followed by others, dozens of them, all climbing aboard his vessel with the same spider-like movements. As they reached the deck, the hands began to gather around his feet, their tiny fingers grasping at his boots and clothing. But they weren't trying to harm him, Hiroshi realized. They were trying to communicate, to tell him something important about their presence in the harbor. As he looked down at the collection of pale hands surrounding him, he could see that they were forming patterns on his deck, arranging themselves in shapes that looked almost like written characters or perhaps a map of the harbor area. The message, when he finally understood it, was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The hands belonged to children who had been passengers on a school excursion ship that had sunk in the harbor decades ago. But their deaths had not been accidental. Someone had deliberately severed their hands before the ship went down, ensuring that they would be unable to swim to safety or signal for help. Now their spirits remained trapped in the harbor, forever trying to complete their journey to whatever destination they had been traveling toward on that long-ago day. The ghostly hands began to tug at Hiroshi's own hands, not violently but with gentle insistence, as if they wanted him to join their eternal voyage aboard the spectral ship. He could feel his own life force being slowly drained away as more and more of the pale hands made contact with his skin, each touch leaving him weaker and more susceptible to their silent pleas for companionship. But as his vision began to blur and his strength ebbed away, Hiroshi remembered something his grandfather had told him about appeasing the spirits of those who had died at sea. With tremendous effort, he reached into his tackle box and pulled out a small bottle of sake that he always carried for good luck. Using the last of his strength, he poured the entire contents into the harbor water while speaking the names of all the children he could see in the old harbor records that were posted in the harbormaster's office. The effect was immediate. The ghostly hands released their grip on him and began to sink back into the water, their pale forms dissolving into the depths like melting snow. The ghost ship began to fade as well, its outline becoming less distinct until it was little more than a shadow on the water. But as it disappeared, Hiroshi could hear the sound of children's voices calling across the harbor, no longer desperate and pleading, but peaceful and grateful, as if they had finally found the rest that had been denied to them for so many years. When the rescue boat found Hiroshi 3 hours later, unconscious and drifting near the old piers, he was unable to explain what had happened to him or why his boat was filled with dead fish but no fishing nets. The official report listed the incident as exhaustion and possible hypothermia, but Hiroshi never told anyone about the ghost ship or the swimming hands that had nearly claimed him for their eternal crew. He never fished alone again after that day, and he made sure that other fishermen in the harbor knew to avoid the area near the old piers, especially during the foggy morning hours when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead seemed thinnest. But sometimes, on particularly calm nights, he would stand on the harbor dock and pour a small amount of sake into the water, listening for the grateful voices of children who had finally found peace beneath the dark waters of Abashiri Harbor. The assignment to photograph the Tanaka wedding at Todaiji Temple in Nara should have been the highlight of Yuki Hayashi's career as a freelance wedding photographer. The ancient temple, with its massive wooden Buddha and centuries of spiritual significance, provided a backdrop that few couples could afford and even fewer photographers were privileged to capture. The bride's family had paid handsomely for exclusive access to certain areas of the temple complex that were normally off-limits to tourists. and Yuki had spent weeks planning shots that would showcase both the couple's happiness and the profound beauty of one of Japan's most sacred sites. The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, when the golden light filtering through the temple's ancient wooden beams would create the perfect atmosphere for romantic portraits. But Yuki had arrived several hours early to scout locations and test lighting conditions, a professional habit that had served her well throughout her 10-year career. The temple complex was vast and filled with hidden corners and architectural details that could provide unique backdrops for the more intimate photographs that modern couples expected from their wedding documentation. As she moved through the less visited areas of the temple with her equipment, Yuki was struck by the profound sense of history that permeated every wooden beam and stone pathway. Todaiji had stood in various forms for over 12 centuries, serving as a spiritual center that had witnessed countless human dramas of joy, sorrow, devotion, and loss. The very air seemed thick with the accumulated prayers and emotions of generations of visitors who had come seeking comfort, guidance, or simply a moment of peace in the presence of the great Buddha. It was while exploring a side hall that contained smaller Buddhist statues and memorial tablets that Yuki first noticed something unusual about the light in certain areas of the temple. Her camera's light meter was giving inconsistent readings, sometimes indicating bright conditions when she was standing in obvious shadow, other times suggesting low light when she was positioned directly beneath a window. At first, she attributed this to the age of the equipment or perhaps interference from the temple's electrical systems. But as she continued her scouting, the anomalies became more pronounced and more difficult to explain. In one particular alcove that contained a collection of memorial tablets dating back several centuries, Yuki's camera began behaving erratically. The autofocus system would engage and disengage randomly, as if it was trying to focus on objects that weren't visible to her naked eye. When she switched to manual focus and attempted to take test shots, the resulting images showed strange artifacts, pale, translucent shapes that appeared to be reaching into the frame from angles that should have been empty space. Curious about these technical anomalies, Yuki began taking systematic photographs of the areas where her equipment was malfunctioning. What she discovered when she reviewed the images on her camera's LCD screen made her question her own sanity. In photograph after photograph, there were additional elements that she hadn't seen while composing the shots. Small, pale hands reaching toward the camera from impossible positions, sometimes appearing to emerge from solid stone walls or wooden pillars. The hands were clearly those of children, tiny and delicate, but they moved between frames in ways that suggested they were aware of being photographed. In one image, a small hand would be reaching toward the left side of the frame, and in the next shot, taken just seconds later from the same position, the hand would be reaching from the right side, as if it had moved to avoid being captured by the camera's mechanical eye. As Yuki continued her investigation, she became aware of sounds that seemed to be coming from within the temple walls themselves. At first, it was just the normal creaking and settling noises that any ancient wooden structure makes as temperature and humidity change throughout the day. But gradually, she began to pick out more specific sounds, soft giggling that echoed strangely in the acoustic environment of the temple, the gentle pattering of small feet running across wooden floors, and most distinctly, the rhythmic clapping of tiny hands in what sounded like a children's game. The sounds seemed to be following her as she moved through the temple, always just at the edge of her hearing, as if invisible children were playing hide and seek with her camera equipment. Sometimes the sounds would cluster around a particular statue or memorial tablet, suggesting that whatever was creating them had some connection to specific elements within the temple's spiritual architecture. It was while she was photographing a particularly ancient statue of Kannon, the goddess of mercy, that Yuki experienced her first direct encounter with whatever was inhabiting the hidden spaces of Todaiji. As she composed her shot, focusing on the gentle expression of the carved deity, she became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. When she looked away from her camera's viewfinder, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A small hand was resting on the base of the statue, pale and translucent but clearly defined. The hand appeared to belong to a child around 5 or 6 years old, and it was positioned as if the invisible child was kneeling before the statue in prayer. But what made the sight truly disturbing was the obvious damage to the hand. The tiny fingers were twisted at unnatural angles, as if they had been broken and never properly healed, and the wrist area showed what looked like bite marks or burn scars. As Yuki watched in fascination and growing horror, more hands began to appear around the statue. Some were placed in prayer positions, others reached upward as if seeking blessing or comfort from the carved deity. All of them showed signs of injury or trauma: missing fingers, burn marks, wounds that suggested violence rather than natural death. The hands belonged to children who had suffered before dying, and they continued to seek the comfort and protection of the temple's spiritual guardians even in death. The ghostly hands began to turn toward Yuki, as if they had suddenly become aware of her presence. Their movements were slow and deliberate, and she could see that they were all making the same gesture, tiny fingers beckoning to her, inviting her to come closer to the statue where they had gathered. The temperature in the alcove dropped noticeably, and her breath began to form visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. As she watched, the hands began to multiply, appearing not just around the canon statue but throughout the alcove. They emerged from behind memorial tablets, reached around the edges of wooden pillars, and seemed to materialize out of thin air at shoulder height. All of them were making that same beckoning gesture, and the air filled with the sound of children's voices calling her name, though she was certain she had never told anyone in the temple what her name was. The voices were sweet and innocent, but there was an undertone of desperation that made Yuki's skin crawl. "Onizen, help us. Take our picture. Remember us." The pleas came from all directions, surrounding her with the sound of children who needed something from her, something that only her camera could provide. Understanding dawned on her as she looked at the reaching hands and listened to the pleading voices. These were the spirits of children who had died at the temple over the centuries, perhaps during times of war, plague, or famine when desperate parents had brought their sick or injured children seeking divine intervention that had come too late. The children had remained at the temple, seeking the comfort and protection they had been denied in life, but they had been forgotten by history, their names lost to time and their suffering unrecorded by any memorial or monument. They wanted her to photograph them, to acknowledge their existence and preserve their memory in the digital permanence of her camera's files. But Yuki could see in the desperate energy of their gestures that this was not a simple request for remembrance. The ghostly children needed something more specific from her camera, something that would allow them to finally find peace after centuries of being invisible and forgotten. As she raised her camera to photograph the gathering spirits, Yuki realized that she was seeing them not just with her naked eye but also in her camera's viewfinder. The hands were clearly visible in the electronic display, reaching toward the lens with their broken fingers extended. But as she prepared to take the photograph, she noticed something terrifying. Her own hands were beginning to fade, becoming as translucent and ghostly as the children's hands that surrounded her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The children didn't just want her to photograph them, they wanted to take her hands, to add them to their collection of severed appendages that continued to reach and grasp for a comfort that death had made impossible to obtain. Her camera would capture their image, but in exchange, she would join them in their eternal quest for recognition and peace, forever reaching for something that remained perpetually beyond their grasp. As her hands continued to fade and the ghostly children pressed closer around her, Yuki could hear new sounds echoing through the temple, the voices of the wedding party arriving for their ceremony, the cheerful chatter of a bride and groom anticipating the happiest day of their lives. The contrast between the joy of the living and the desperation of the dead created a surreal atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. With tremendous effort, She managed to lower her camera without taking the photograph the ghostly children so desperately wanted. The hands reaching toward her paused in their movements, and she could hear disappointed sighs echoing through the alcove. But she had broken the spell that was stealing her own life force, and slowly, her hands began to regain their normal appearance and solidity. The ghostly children's hands began to withdraw, fading back into the shadows and architectural details of the temple. But as they disappeared, Yuki heard their voices one last time, no longer pleading but filled with a resignation that spoke of centuries of disappointment and rejection. Another one who won't help us. Still invisible. Still forgotten. She fled the alcove and rejoined the wedding party, spending the rest of the day photographing a celebration of love and life that seemed almost impossibly bright and joyful after her encounter with the desperate spirits of the temple's forgotten children. The wedding photographs turned out beautifully, capturing the happiness and hope of a couple beginning their new life together in one of Japan's most sacred spaces. But when Yuki developed her film the following week, she discovered that every single photograph from the temple contained the same anomaly: small, pale hands reaching into the frame from impossible angles, their broken fingers eternally grasping for the recognition and peace that continued to elude them. She never displayed those particular images and never spoke about what she had experienced in the alcove of forgotten children. But she made sure to return to Todaiji on the anniversary of her visit each year, bringing flowers and prayers for the nameless children whose spirits continued to haunt the ancient temple's hidden corners. St. Mary's Hospital had been closed for renovations for 8 months when nurse Akiko Sasaki was assigned to the overnight security detail, a temporary position that paid surprisingly well for what seemed like straightforward work. The hospital administration needed someone with medical training to monitor the building's environmental systems and ensure that any remaining medical equipment stayed properly maintained while construction crews worked to modernize the facility. As a registered nurse with 15 years of experience in pediatric care, Akiko was uniquely qualified for the role, and the solitary nature of the work appealed to her desire for quiet contemplation after a difficult divorce that had left her questioning many of her life choices. The building was a testament to mid-20th century institutional architecture, 7 floors of concrete and glass that had served the Shibuya district faithfully for nearly 50 years before age and changing medical standards had necessitated the extensive renovation project. Most of the medical equipment had been relocated to other facilities, but the basic infrastructure remained intact: patient rooms with their distinctive hospital beds, nursing stations equipped with outdated but functional monitoring systems, and the maze of corridors that connected the various departments and specialty areas. Akiko's duties were relatively simple: hourly rounds to check temperature and humidity levels, basic maintenance of the emergency power systems, and monitoring of the security cameras that watched over the most valuable remaining equipment. The construction crews worked during daylight hours, leaving the building completely empty from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. For someone who had spent her entire nursing career in busy hospital environments filled with constant activity and urgent demands, the silence and solitude of the overnight shift was both refreshing and slightly unsettling. During her first few weeks on the job, Akiko had noticed that certain floors of the hospital seemed to maintain traces of their former functions despite the removal of most medical equipment. The pediatric ward on the 4th floor, where she had hoped to work before the hospital's closure, still carried the faint scent of the special disinfectants used in children's medical environments. The walls retained their cheerful decorations, faded cartoon characters, and educational posters that had been designed to make young patients feel less frightened during their treatment. It was on the pediatric floor that Akiko first began to notice anomalies that couldn't be explained by normal building maintenance issues. During her nightly rounds, she would occasionally find evidence that someone had been in the patient rooms despite the building's supposedly secure status. Bed linens would be disturbed, as if someone had been lying on them. Medical charts would be moved from where she had left them, sometimes reorganized in ways that suggested someone was actually reading and updating them. Most puzzling of all, she would sometimes find small toys and coloring books that hadn't been there during her previous rounds, as if invisible children were still being admitted to the abandoned ward. The toys were particularly intriguing because they appeared to be decades old, the kind of simple wooden blocks and cloth dolls that had been common in Japanese hospitals during the 1970s and 1980s. They were well-worn and showed signs of having been beloved by multiple children over many years, but they appeared to be in remarkably good condition for their apparent age. Sometimes she would find the toys arranged in specific patterns on the floors of patient rooms, as if invisible children were playing elaborate games that required careful organization and planning. As the weeks passed, Akiko began to hear sounds that shouldn't have been possible in the empty building. At first, they were subtle, the soft whoosh of automatic doors opening and closing, the gentle beeping of medical monitors, the distant sound of nurses' stations receiving calls from patient rooms. She attributed these sounds to the building's automated systems, residual programming that continued to function despite the absence of patients and medical staff. But gradually, the sounds became more specific and more difficult to explain through normal technological means. She began to hear what sounded like children's voices coming from the patient rooms, soft conversations, and occasional crying that suggested young patients experiencing the fear and discomfort that were unfortunately common in pediatric medical environments. The sounds were so realistic that she found herself responding with the professional instincts developed over years of nursing practice, moving toward the sounds to provide comfort and assistance to children who turned out not to be there. The most disturbing discovery came during her third month on the security detail, when she entered one of the larger patient rooms that had formerly been used for children requiring intensive monitoring. The room contained the basic furniture that had been too heavy or built in to remove: a hospital bed, a small table, and several wall-mounted fixtures for medical equipment. But arranged on the bed, positioned as if a child were lying there receiving treatment, were dozens of small, pale hands. The hands were clearly those of children, ranging in size from toddler small to perhaps 10 years old. They were positioned in various gestures. Some reached upward as if grasping for something, others were curled into loose fists, and several were arranged in pairs as if they were clasped together in prayer or fear. All of the hands showed signs of medical intervention. Some had the small bandages and tape marks that indicated for insertion sites, others showed the bruising and needle marks associated with frequent blood draws, and several displayed the pale scars of surgical procedures. What made the sight truly horrifying was the realization that these were not props or medical training aids. They were actual severed hands, perfectly preserved despite what must have been years or decades since they had been separated from their original owners. The hands were positioned with care and obvious affection, as if someone had been trying to comfort the disembodied appendages, or perhaps arrange them in ways that would minimize their apparent trauma. As Akiko stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the impossible scene before her, she became aware of a sound that made her skin crawl, soft giggling that seemed to be coming from the hands themselves. The laughter was innocent and playful, the kind of sound that healthy children make during games and celebrations. But in this context, surrounded by evidence of medical trauma and separation, the giggling took on a nightmarish quality that spoke of suffering that had somehow been transformed into a parody of joy. The hands began to move slowly at first, but with increasing animation. Some of them turned toward Akiko, their tiny fingers beckoning to her with gestures that she recognized from years of working with frightened children. Others began to make the specific hand signals that she had learned for communicating with young patients who were too sick or scared to speak, pointing to indicate pain, making grasping motions to request comfort, forming the simple signs that children used when words failed them. As she watched in horrified fascination, more hands began to appear throughout the room. They seemed to materialize from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, all of them bearing the distinctive markings of pediatric medical care. Some floated through the air with their own purpose, Others crawled across surfaces using their fingers like spider legs, but all of them moved toward Akiko with obvious intent. The ghostly hands were trying to communicate something to her. She realized they were making the gestures and movements that she had seen thousands of times during her nursing career. Children reaching for their parents, asking for water, indicating that they were in pain or frightened. But there was something different about these particular gestures, something more desperate and specific than the normal requests of pediatric patients. As the hands gathered around her, Akiko began to understand their message. These were the hands of children who had died in the hospital over the decades, patients who had been too young or too sick to survive their medical conditions despite the best efforts of the medical staff. But their deaths had not been peaceful. They had died reaching for comfort that never came, grasping for parents who couldn't save them, trying to communicate needs that couldn't be met by human medicine or compassion. The hands wanted her help, not as a security guard but as a nurse. They were still trying to communicate their needs, still reaching for the comfort and care that death had made impossible for them to receive. The ghostly children whose hands continued to seek medical attention were trapped in the hospital, forever patients in a ward that existed between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond death. But as Akiko reached out to comfort the desperate hands, she realized that touching them would mean joining them in their eternal vigil. The pale fingers that grasped at her uniform were cold beyond the temperature of death, and she could feel her own life force being drawn toward whatever realm the ghostly children inhabited. The hands were not just seeking comfort. They were seeking companionship, trying to recruit a nurse who would stay with them forever in their haunted pediatric ward. She backed away from the reaching hands, but found that they were not limited to the single patient room. As she moved through the pediatric ward, she discovered that every room now contained similar collections of severed hands, all reaching toward her with the desperate needs of children who had never recovered from their final illnesses. The corridors filled with the sound of children's voices calling for their nurses, asking for medicine that could no longer help them, begging for comfort that could only be provided by someone willing to cross the boundary between life and death. The spectral hands followed her as she fled toward the stairwell, their tiny fingers leaving cold tracks on her skin wherever they touched her. She could hear the voices of the ghostly children calling her name, asking her to come back to their rooms, to provide the care they had been seeking for decades. But she also heard something else in their voices, the understanding that she, like so many others before her, would ultimately abandon them to their eternal medical vigil. Akiko managed to escape the building just as the sun was rising, ending her security shift with the realization that she could never return to work in that haunted hospital. She submitted her resignation that morning, citing personal reasons, and never spoke about what she had experienced on the pediatric ward. But she made sure that other healthcare workers in the Tokyo area knew to avoid employment at St. Mary's, creating a reputation that ensured the building would remain understaffed and eventually lead to its permanent closure rather than renovation. Sometimes, late at night when she was working at her new job in a different hospital, Akiko would feel invisible fingers tugging at her uniform, and she would hear the faint voices of children calling for medical attention that she could no longer provide. The ghostly patients from St. Mary's had marked her as their nurse, and no matter how far she moved or how many years passed, part of her would always belong to the haunted pediatric ward where small hands continued to reach for comfort in the darkness between life and death. The narrow alley between Gion and Pontocho districts in Kyoto was not marked on any tourist maps, and even longtime residents of the area would have been hard-pressed to explain how to find it without getting lost in the maze of traditional buildings and modern construction that defined the city's historic heart. But for Masato Watanabe, an antique dealer with 30 years of experience hunting for forgotten treasures in Japan's most hidden corners, the alley represented exactly the kind of overlooked location where the most valuable discoveries were often made. The shop itself was easy to miss, squeezed between a traditional tea house and a narrow residential building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Taisho era. The storefront was so small that it could barely accommodate a single customer at a time, and the hand-painted sign above the door was so faded that Masato had to squint to make out the characters that identified it as Kodomo no Te, children's hands. The name struck him as unusual for an antique shop, but many of the older dealers in Kyoto had eccentric naming conventions that reflected personal histories or family traditions that outsiders couldn't fully understand. The proprietor was an elderly woman who appeared to be at least 80 years old, with the kind of deeply lined face and careful movements that spoke of a lifetime spent handling delicate objects with reverence and expertise. She introduced herself simply as Yamada-san and explained that her shop specialized in items related to children, toys, clothing, furniture, and educational materials from various periods of Japanese history. The narrow space was packed from floor to ceiling with carefully organized displays that showcased centuries of childhood artifacts. From Edo period wooden toys to Meiji-era school supplies to more recent items from the Showa period. What immediately caught Masato's attention was the extraordinary condition of the items in the shop. Despite their obvious age, everything appeared to be perfectly preserved, as if it had been carefully maintained by someone with both the knowledge and resources to prevent the normal deterioration that affected antique materials. Wooden toys showed no signs of age-related cracking, textile items retained their original colors and strength, and paper goods looked as fresh as if they had been produced yesterday rather than decades or centuries ago. As he browsed through the shop's collection, Masato began to notice patterns that struck him as unusual even by the standards of specialized antique dealers. Many of the items appeared to be incomplete sets, single mittens without their partners, individual shoes from pairs, solitary chopsticks from sets that would have originally contained multiple pieces. Most intriguing of all, there was an entire section of the shop dedicated to what appeared to be handprint art and hand-related craft projects, all created by children but preserved with museum-quality care. The handprint collection was extraordinary in its scope and variety. There were clay impression tiles dating back to the Edo period, ink paintings from the Meiji era that incorporated children's handprints as decorative elements, and more recent pieces that showed the evolution of childhood art education throughout Japan's modern history. All of the handprints were small, clearly made by children between the ages of 4 and 10, and they were arranged in chronological order that told a story of changing artistic techniques and cultural attitudes toward childhood creativity. But as Masato examined the handprint collection more carefully, he began to notice something disturbing about the way the pieces were displayed. Each handprint was mounted individually, rather than as part of larger artworks or family collections. The presentation suggested that the handprints themselves were the primary objects of interest, rather than the creative works they had originally been part of. Some of the displays included small placards with dates and what appeared to be children's names, but many of the names were partially obscured or had faded to illegibility over time. Yamada-san watched him browse with the patient attention of someone accustomed to serious collectors who needed time and space to properly evaluate potential purchases. But when Masato began asking questions about the handprint collection, her demeanor changed subtly. Her answers became more evasive, and she began steering him toward other areas of the shop, as if the handprint displays were not actually available for sale despite being prominently featured in the store's layout. "The handprints are very special," she explained in response to his inquiries. "They have been in my family for many generations. Some are not for sale. They are here for preservation purposes." Her explanation raised more questions than it answered, particularly her emphasis on the word preservation, and the way she glanced toward the back of the shop when she spoke about her family's involvement with the collection. Masato's curiosity was further piqued when he noticed that several of the handprint displays appeared to be equipped with small motion sensors, the kind typically used in museums to monitor visitor interaction with valuable exhibits. The sensors were discreetly positioned, But Masato's experience with high-end antique security systems allowed him to recognize the technology. What puzzled him was why handprint displays would require such sophisticated monitoring equipment, especially in a small shop that didn't appear to have the kind of foot traffic that would justify expensive security measures. As he continued his examination of the shop's unusual inventory, Masato became aware of sounds that seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the building. At first, he thought he was hearing the normal activities of neighboring businesses, the clatter of dishes from the tea house next door, footsteps from the residential building's upper floors, the distant hum of modern Kyoto's traffic and commerce. But as he listened more carefully, he began to pick out sounds that were more specific and somehow more intimate. Children's voices engaged in what sounded like play or learning activities, the soft clapping of small hands, and occasional bursts of giggling that seemed to echo strangely in the narrow confines of the antique shop. When he mentioned the sounds to Yamada-san, she simply nodded and explained that the building was very old and that sounds carried in unexpected ways through the traditional wooden construction. Children have always been drawn to this place, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Even now, they come to play in the spaces between the buildings. Their laughter brings life to old things. But something about her explanation didn't ring true to Masato. The sounds he was hearing seemed to be coming from inside the shop itself, not from external sources. And there was something about the quality of the children's voices that struck him as odd. They sounded distant and slightly muffled, as if they were speaking from another room or perhaps from behind walls or barriers that affected the acoustics of their speech. It was while he was examining a particularly intriguing collection of Meiji-era children's books that Masato made a discovery that changed his entire perception of the shop and its mysterious proprietor. One of the books fell open to a page that contained not text or illustrations, but what appeared to be actual handprints pressed directly into the paper. The prints were made in a reddish-brown substance that could have been ink, paint, or something more organic and disturbing. As he studied the handprints more closely, Masato realized that they appeared to be moving. Not dramatically, but with the subtle shifting motion that became apparent when he watched them from the corner of his eye. The tiny fingers seemed to flex and grasp, as if the hands that had made the prints were still somehow present and trying to reach through the paper toward him. The effect was so unsettling that he quickly closed the book, but not before noticing that the reddish-brown substance of the handprints had left faint stains on his own fingers. The stains were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, like a weak but persistent heartbeat. As he tried to wipe them away with his handkerchief, Masato noticed that more stains were appearing on other objects throughout the shop. The handprint displays showed fresh marks that hadn't been there moments before, and even some of the toys and furniture pieces bore small, reddish-brown fingerprints that seemed to materialize as he watched. Yamada-san noticed his growing alarm and moved closer to him, her elderly face showing an expression of concern mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "You can see them, can't you?" she asked quietly. "The children's marks. Not everyone has that ability. It's a gift, or perhaps a curse, depending on how you choose to use it." Before Masato could respond, the sounds of children's voices grew louder and more distinct. He could now clearly make out individual words and phrases, all in the high, sweet tones of young children engaged in play. But there was something wrong with what they were saying. Instead of the normal chatter of childhood games, the voices were calling for help, asking for their hands back, pleading for someone to free them from whatever situation they found themselves in. "Help us, Ajizan. We can't play without our hands. Please give us back what was taken." The voices came from all directions, seeming to originate from within the walls of the shop itself. As Masato listened in growing horror, he began to understand that the children's voices were not coming from living children playing nearby, but from some source much closer and infinitely more disturbing. The handprint displays throughout the shop began to glow with their own inner light, and Masato could see that the prints were no longer static impressions but were moving and reaching, as if the hands that had made them were trying to push through from whatever realm they now inhabited. Some of the prints began to pull away from their mounting surfaces entirely, becoming three-dimensional as pale, translucent hands reached into the physical space of the shop. The ghostly hands were small and clearly belonged to children, but they all showed signs of violent separation from their original bodies. Some had ragged edges where they had been torn away, others showed burn marks or blade cuts, and several displayed the distinctive bruising patterns that suggested they had been forcibly removed from struggling children. All of them moved with desperate purpose, reaching toward Masato and Yamada-san with tiny fingers that grasped at the air as if trying to reclaim something that had been stolen from them. As more hands materialized throughout the shop, Masato began to see the terrible truth behind the antique dealer's specialized collection. The items in the shop were not simply artifacts of childhood. They were trophies taken from children who had been harmed, mementos of young lives that had been cut short by someone who collected not just objects but the very essence of childhood itself. The handprints were not artistic creations but evidence of crimes that spanned generations, carefully preserved by a family that had built their business on the suffering of the innocent. Yamada-san watched his realization with the patient expression of someone who had witnessed this revelation many times before. "You understand now," she said calmly. "The children come here because this is where their hands are kept. They cannot rest until they are reunited with what was taken from them. But that reunion requires a price. Someone must take their place. Someone must become the keeper of their collection." The ghostly hands pressed closer around Masato, their tiny fingers leaving cold trails on his skin wherever they made contact. He could feel his own life force being drawn toward whatever realm the handless children inhabited, and he began to understand that Yamada-san was not simply the shop's proprietor but its prisoner, bound to serve as guardian of the severed hands until someone else could be found to take her place. But as the spectral children's hands reached for him with increasing desperation, Masato remembered something his grandfather had taught him about appeasing the spirits of those who had died unjustly. Using the last of his strength before the ghostly hands could complete their claim on him, he began to speak the names written on the faded placards throughout the shop, calling out to each child by name and acknowledging their individual suffering and loss. The effect was immediate and profound. The reaching hands paused in their movements, and the children's voices grew quiet as if they were listening carefully to each name being spoken. As Masato continued his recitation, the ghostly hands began to glow more brightly, but instead of the cold, desperate light they had shown before, they now emanated a warm, peaceful radiance that filled the shop with comfort rather than terror. One by one, the hands began to fade away, not disappearing but transforming into something more peaceful and complete. As each hand vanished, Masato could hear a child's voice saying, "Thank you," in the distant, contented tone of someone who had finally found the rest they had been seeking. The shop itself began to change, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as decades of accumulated suffering was finally acknowledged and released. When the last of the ghostly hands had faded away, Yamada-san collapsed into a chair, her face showing the relief of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for far too long. "They can rest now," she whispered. Someone finally spoke their names. Someone finally acknowledged what was done to them. She looked at Masato with gratitude and exhaustion. "I have been waiting 70 years for someone who could see them and speak for them. Now I can rest too." As the sun set over the narrow Kyoto alley, the antique shop began to fade like morning mist, taking with it the evidence of generations of collected suffering. Masato found himself standing alone in what appeared to be an empty storefront, with no sign that the shop or its elderly proprietor had ever existed. But in his pocket, he found a small piece of paper with dozens of children's names written in careful handwriting, and he understood that his role was now to ensure that those names were never forgotten. that the children who had suffered in silence would finally be remembered and honored. He never spoke publicly about his experience in the mysterious antique shop, but he made sure that each name on the list was researched and memorialized, creating small monuments and charitable donations that honored the memory of children whose lives had been cut short by cruelty and whose spirits had finally found peace through the simple act of being acknowledged and named. And sometimes, on quiet evenings in Kyoto, visitors to certain temples and memorial gardens would notice small handprints pressed into stone or wood. Not signs of haunting, but gentle reminders that even the smallest victims of cruelty deserved to be remembered and mourned. The legends of Akateko remind us that some mysteries are better left undisturbed, some roads better traveled in groups, and some encounters with the supernatural leave marks that never fade. These 10 travelers discovered that the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead is thinner than most people realize, especially in the quiet hours when darkness conceals both natural and unnatural phenomena. But our journey into Japan's hidden terrors is far from over. The isolated offshore oil rigs that dot the waters around Japan hold their own collection of horrors, where workers face not just the dangers of industrial accidents and harsh weather, but encounters with entities that should not exist in the rational world of modern petroleum extraction.